Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Jackson, and I'm 30 years old. I want to share a chilling experience that happened to my grandfather Thomas when he lived in a remote part of rural Montana in the early 1970s. I don't recall the exact name of the place, but what matters is that the story is truly unsettling. My grandfather had received a job offer to work on a farm, where he would need to handle any task assigned to him. As he always said, things were quite different back then, and for him, it was essential to know how to do a little bit of everything, and to do it well. He told me that one day, while returning home, a strong man on horseback approached him, inviting him to work on a farm. This gentleman handed him the address and explained in detail how to get there. My grandfather, by the way, had many talents. He knew a bit about veterinary medicine, construction, planting, and various other things. At this stage of his life, he wasn't yet married to my grandmother, so he accepted any type of work, no matter where it was. As Grandpa liked to reminisce, everything was more complicated back then. Even trips were usually made on foot or riding on mules. So upon receiving this proposal for the farm, he knew he needed to present himself as quickly as possible to not lose the opportunity. Without hesitation, he set out that same day, heading toward the farm, which was about 19 miles from where he lived. When he told me this story, I asked why he didn't think about finding a way to go by car or bus. As always, my grandfather already had a quick answer ready. My boy, a man's journey is made with his own feet. I always walked to any place I needed to go. I never depended on anyone for anything, and if I had to go somewhere, regardless of where it was, I'd go with my own legs. Back then, public transportation didn't have the same quality as today. Buses existed, but they didn't run every day and only made the outbound journey on specific days, as the return was on another date. So my grandfather decided to leave on Saturday to arrive at the farm by Monday, or even earlier. He prepared his canteen with water, grabbed some things to eat, and with a bundle on his back, set out on his journey early Saturday morning. He told me that when night fell, he settled under a large rock to sleep. The next morning, he gathered his things and continued his journey. When he felt hungry, he improvised a small fire to prepare the salted meat he carried or roasted any bird he hunted with his slingshot. The water was what he carried, or sometimes what he found in some well or pond along the way. But to his misfortune, the canteen where he carried the water began to leak, and he ended up without a drop on Sunday. He almost got sick from thirst, unable to find a well or any source where he could refresh himself. At one point, my grandfather finally spotted a small lake where several goats were drinking and leaving their waste. He thought he had found salvation, but there was no sign of anyone taking care of the goats, much less a house nearby. He had no choice but to drink that dirty water mixed with animal urine and feces. After subjecting himself to this, he soon realized that everything seemed to be going wrong. He thought it might be a bad omen. He always told me that if something started to go wrong from the beginning, it was better not to insist. I paid close attention when he shared these lessons. As soon as he finished drinking, my grandfather decided to head straight to the farm without any more stops. He arrived around noon on Sunday, a day before the agreed time. But instead of resting, the boss immediately asked him to fetch more pasture to feed the animals. My grandfather had never refused work, but that day he felt an enormous desire to give up and go back home, because he expected to at least take a bath, eat something, and rest a little from the long journey. That cold reception made him think about leaving the job, feeling that the boss had been disrespectful. Even though he was displeased with the job before even starting, he decided to stay at least the first week. After completing the task that the boss asked for, he was taken to a small house where he would be staying. It was simple but well kept. Dinner was served at a large table on the porch of the boss's house, and he could only go there when called. When it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the boss shouted, letting him know that he could already have dinner. Upon arriving at the table, my grandfather noticed that the food seemed like leftovers from lunch, perhaps even reheated. To make matters worse, he was alone for dinner in that large hall. At that moment, he was certain that this place wasn't for him. He decided he needed to leave as soon as possible and return home. Despite feeling uncomfortable, hunger spoke louder, and he ended up eating the food that was served to him. While eating, he observed the boss's enormous house, noticing that there was no one visible inside. He only heard sounds that seemed to be from children and adult voices, but he couldn't see anyone. Given everything, he decided he would spend only that night there and leave the next day. When night fell, he hung his hammock in the house's living room and soon lay down, exhausted from the journey full of setbacks. In a few minutes, he was already asleep, but his rest didn't last long. Someone threw him from the hammock, hurling him against the wall. Frightened, he thought that perhaps it was the boss himself doing that, since he was the only person he had seen since his arrival. My grandfather described that as the most terrifying night of his life. The house was immersed in complete darkness, a blackness where you couldn't see an inch in front of you. There was no electric light, not even a gas lamp to illuminate the environment. My grandfather was still lying on the floor, somewhat disoriented by everything that was happening, when suddenly the same thing that had thrown him to the floor began to shake him by the arm, telling him to leave that place as quickly as possible, claiming that the house didn't belong to him and that he was being an intruder. Unable to see anything, he desperately tried to break free from it, but he couldn't either get loose or scream for help. It was then that, amid the terror and without knowing how to pray properly, he began to say, "My Father, our Lord Jesus Christ, help me please." As if by a miracle, as soon as he began to say these words, he felt that thing, a masculine figure, suddenly disappear or perhaps fall to the floor. Taking advantage of the moment, my grandfather ran to the door, but it was completely locked. In the darkness, he tried the kitchen door. It was closed too. Feeling along the walls in search of a window, he found nothing. It was then that he suddenly began to perceive the silhouette of a man. It was so dark that even in the complete darkness, he could distinguish that presence. That figure grabbed him again by the arms, but this time dragged him through the house, taking him back to the living room. In desperation, he began to repeat the same words, "Lord, help me, Our Lady, Jesus, protect me, for the love of God, help me." And once again, as soon as he said these words, the figure released him. He told me that he never managed to see the face, only a dark silhouette in the midst of the darkness. All he knew was that that man was in there, trying to do some harm to him. He knew that there was nowhere to run. He was in the middle of nowhere with a mysterious figure inside the house, apparently trying to kill him. My grandfather said that thing had superhuman strength, and there was no point in trying to resist. All he could do was pray and ask for the Creator's help. Amid the prayers, he felt that the thing released him and threw him against the wall with force. As he got up, he didn't know if it was a hallucination or if he was really hearing voices around the house. The blow was so strong that he even felt his spine crack. It was then that, amid the despair, he noticed that the kitchen window was open. He didn't think twice. The only chance was to try to escape through there. By a miracle, he managed to pass through. He said that if he had been a bit more robust, he might not have been able to get through that window, and he couldn't imagine what his fate would have been. Upon leaving, he began to run back home, facing the 19 miles of road. In the middle of the way, amid the darkness, he began to hear children crying, which almost broke him down. He thought he was going to die, as the children's laments continued to echo along the way. When he arrived home, it was already morning, and he was completely shaken by what he had experienced. Some time later, he discovered that that farm had been abandoned for many years, and that all the former residents had died. The story was even more sinister. The farm's caretaker had murdered the boss and his family, and then taken his own life, hanging himself in that same house where my grandfather had slept. He told me that at that time, he was very young and didn't talk much with people. He learned all of this later at a tavern during a conversation, and concluded that if he had asked about that place beforehand, he would never have gone through this experience. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My father's parents passed away when I was very young, so I have few memories of them. Everything I know about who they were came from the stories my father and Aunt Clara told me. From what I understand, they were deeply religious, and their house always felt somewhat somber, with those enormous portraits of Jesus and Bible psalms scattered across the walls. The truth is, I never paid much attention to all that, especially since I was always closer to my mother's parents. Last year, my father suffered a serious car accident and died instantly. My sister Sophia and I returned to our hometown to stay by our mother's side and take care of all the funeral arrangements. It was an extremely difficult time, especially for my mom. She was completely devastated. We all were, but she simply couldn't handle everything without Dad. The funeral was simple, but it was good to see so many colleagues and friends of my father showing up to pay their respects. Even though he was a more reserved man, it became clear to me that he was deeply loved. I gave a rather emotional speech and shared some funny stories about him. When I looked at the audience, I recognized almost everyone except for an elderly couple in the last row. They were very tall and thin with serious expressions, but there was something about them that seemed vaguely familiar. When the ceremony ended, Sophia and I stayed with Mom at the church entrance, thanking everyone for their presence. This elderly couple was the last to leave. Mom was so upset that she couldn't say anything, so I asked how they knew my father. Their response left us completely speechless. The woman fell silent and lowered her face, wiping away the tears that streamed down her cheeks, while the man said directly that he was our grandfather. Like Sophia, I was paralyzed and at a loss for words. It was then that he explained that he and his wife had given my father up for adoption when he was just a baby, which meant that the grandparents we knew weren't the real ones, or at least not the biological ones. I looked at my mother for some confirmation, but she must have already gone to the bathroom, probably to wash her face. The man then stepped forward and wrapped me in a tight embrace, asking me to call him Grandpa Harvey. His wife also hugged me, suggesting that I call her Grandma Elizabeth. It was an awkward moment. I was full of questions, but couldn't even think of how to begin. An uncomfortable silence hung for a few seconds. During this time, I found myself observing this man with attention, analyzing the shape of his nose, the contour of his eyes, and the intensity of the blue color of his irises, the same as my father's. I always found it curious that my paternal grandparents, as well as my Aunt Clara, had dark eyes, while my father possessed that deep blue that he passed on to my sister Sophia, which was exactly the same as the man standing before me. It was at that moment that Grandpa Harvey took out a small piece of paper with his phone number and handed it to me, suggesting that I call later to talk better. After that, they said goodbye. When my mother returned, we were still processing what had just happened. I asked if she knew that my father had been adopted, and she simply confirmed with a yes, without going into details. We returned to Mom's house, ate some of the food that the neighbors had brought, and went to rest. The next day, Sophia asked me if I wanted to call our biological grandparents and see if we could arrange lunch with them. Although there were so many other things going through my mind, my curiosity spoke louder. I dialed the number, and Grandpa Harvey invited us to dinner at his house. We asked Mom if that was okay, and she said yes, that she needed some time for herself. A few hours later, we arrived at the address they had given us. It was an impressive house on the outskirts of the city. A huge 2-story mansion with an extensive courtyard, an exuberant garden, and an infinity pool that took your breath away. Growing up, Sophia and I didn't have many luxuries. Not that we were exactly poor, but we knew that our parents worked quite hard to support 2 children. I was irritated to discover that we had such rich grandparents right there on the other side of the city, and they had never extended a hand to us. I noticed that Sophia seemed even more bothered, especially because she was still facing college debts. Just thinking that her life would have been much easier with the support of our biological grandparents made her as angry as me. However, we decided to set these feelings aside for a moment and rang the doorbell. It was a chance to reconnect, and we couldn't let ourselves be carried away by emotions. Grandma Elizabeth greeted us quickly, hugging us with great enthusiasm before inviting us in. The inside of the house was even more dazzling than the exterior. It was evident that they lived quite comfortably. She led us to a huge dining room where a gigantic table was set with a variety of dishes. Grandpa Harvey was at the end of the table. When he saw us, he stood up and gave us a warm hug. I wasn't very hungry, but I felt it was my obligation to sit down. Sophia settled beside me, and soon my sister, who is quite direct, began to pour out all the questions that were eating away at us. Without beating around the bush, she went straight to the point. Why did they give Dad up for adoption? Why didn't they approach before he passed away? How did they intend to be part of our lives from now on? With Sophia's incisive questions, our grandparents exchanged quick glances before Grandma Elizabeth tried to answer. But Grandpa Harvey interrupted her, suggesting that it was better to eat before continuing the conversation. To not appear rude, I began to eat, while Sophia, with her arms crossed, refused to touch the food as Grandpa Harvey insisted that she try it. But she remained firm, saying she wouldn't take a single bite until they answered her questions. The room sank into an uncomfortable silence, and soon I realized that I was the only one eating. Our grandparents were staring at me fixedly, and Sophia maintained a visibly angry look to ease the atmosphere. Grandma Elizabeth said she wouldn't tell us anything until Sophia at least tried a little of the food. She claimed that she had spent the whole day preparing everything, although it was clear that they had cooks to do this kind of work. Sophia was about to taste the food, but suddenly she stopped and asked if I was okay. Until then, I hadn't noticed anything strange, but at that moment, an unusual tingling sensation took over my face, and my eyes began to feel heavy. An intense dizziness set in, and I really thought I was going to pass out. I tried to ask Grandma Elizabeth what was happening, but my voice wouldn't come out anymore. "What did you do to him?" Sophia shouted at them. Instead of giving an explanation, our grandmother merely commented that everyone could have eaten in peace, insinuating that it was Sophia's fault for not touching the food. Without thinking twice, Sophia grabbed my arm and tried to help me up. "Come on, we need to get out of here," she said, guiding me hurriedly toward the door. I could barely walk, so Sophia was dragging me as best she could. Meanwhile, our grandparents remained standing, as if nothing was happening. But as soon as we approached the door, 3 employees appeared and threw themselves on Sophia, knocking her to the floor. I also ended up falling, feeling that the world was beginning to vanish around me, already imagining that I was about to lose consciousness. From where I was, I could still see one of the employees kicking Sophia until she stopped resisting. I saw Grandpa Harvey approach, leaning over me with a frightening smile plastered on his face. "I'm sorry things got a little violent," he said. "You see, your grandmother is very sick and needs a kidney transplant from a close relative. Don't take it personally, but it needs to be one of you." He said something else, but at that moment my mind went blank and I passed out. When I regained consciousness, I was in my car parked by the roadside. Sophia was beside me, but still unconscious. I woke her with a gentle shake and realized that she was covered in cuts and bruises, besides looking very pale. "Are you okay?" I asked. After a few seconds, she responded in a weak voice, "I don't feel well." She lifted her shirt, revealing a long scar on her side. The reason was evident. Our grandparents had taken one of her kidneys. I took her quickly to the hospital, where the doctor assured us that she would be fine with just one kidney. The doctor wanted to know what had happened, and upon hearing our story, she was shocked. She called the police to report the organ theft, but they did nothing. We discovered that our grandparents had strong connections in the city, and no one dared to investigate. Since then, we've never heard from them again. It seems like they got what they wanted, and now we're just taking care of our mother, trying to move forward after this frightening encounter with our grandparents from hell. I don't even know where to begin. All that understanding I thought I had about my family simply dissolved in the blink of an eye. And the truth is, I'm still trying to process everything I discovered. Let me tell you from the beginning. It was an ordinary Saturday like so many others, and I decided to visit my grandmother Alina, who lives in the countryside cottage where I spent my childhood. That place has always been like a home to me. The warmth of the fireplace, the aroma of cookies coming out of the oven, and the music playing on the old radios that still work. Few things in the world bring me as much joy as going there and spending time with her. But after what I discovered that day, everything seems different. When I arrived, my grandmother received me with that warm smile of hers, and a hug that made me feel like I was 7 years old again. Soon we went to the kitchen, and she prepared my cup of coffee as usual. One of the things I loved most about these visits was sitting at the kitchen counter with her, drinking our coffee, and talking about anything that came to mind. It was like a little ritual just between us. We talked for a while, and she mentioned that I had arrived at the right time to help with cleaning the attic. I joked that she was setting me up, and we both laughed. Soon after, I commented that I wanted to look at the old family photos, and this made her start remembering stories from when she and my grandfather were beginning to date. After a while, my grandmother went down to the kitchen to prepare another batch of cookies, while I continued organizing things. Among the old photo albums, I found an image of her embracing a tall, handsome blonde man who wasn't my grandfather William. I knew that my grandmother had had a first husband, the father of Aunt Irma, the eldest of the sisters, but he had died of a heart attack more than 50 years ago, when Aunt Irma was still a 1-year-old baby. So none of us ever got to meet him. A year later, my grandmother met Grandpa William, married him, and had 3 more children, including my father. Unfortunately, Grandpa William also left us a few years ago. The photo was inside an old envelope, covered in dust and cobwebs, thrown at the bottom of several boxes. It was practically by chance that I ended up finding it. At that moment, I couldn't resist my curiosity and started taking out everything that was in the envelope. To my surprise, it seemed that all the items were linked to my grandmother's first husband. Letters, photos, the wedding ring, and even an old diary with yellowed pages, and a smell of stagnant time that rose as soon as I opened it. I began to read the passages from my grandmother's youth, always keeping an eye on the door, afraid that she would catch me messing with something as personal as her diary. But curiosity was stronger. The diary was fascinating and seemed to start precisely on the day of her wedding to her first husband. Don't think it's strange, since, as I said, everything in that envelope seemed to be about Richard, who was my grandmother's first husband. The beginning of the diary was quite light. She described the excitement about the wedding and the intense love she felt for him. Further on, she talked about the wonderful honeymoon and the small routines of life as a couple. But as I turned the pages, the tone began to change, and I started to find quite disturbing accounts. In some parts, she mentioned Richard's unstable temperament, and the aggressive behavior that emerged whenever he drank. As I progressed in my reading, the excerpts that narrated a deeply abusive relationship became increasingly intense. My grandmother described scenes of physical and verbal violence that were frighteningly strong. As the diary progressed, you could feel the despair, sadness, and fear she lived with at that time. At one point, she even wrote about the desire to ask for a divorce and the dread that he might do something terrible to her or even to her small daughter. From what was described in that diary, this man was a true monster. Maybe that's why my grandmother never talked about him. But as I continued reading, I found a newspaper clipping among the pages and felt a chill run down my spine. The headline said, "Man found dead in the forest with multiple stab wounds." My hands began to tremble at that moment. The article was from 1963 and detailed that a man named Richard Hollister had been found dead in the middle of the forest with several stab wounds to the chest. There was no clue about the culprit, and the text mentioned how his death had been a tragedy for the community. This was the name of my grandmother's first husband. But I realized that this wasn't the only clipping. Right behind, almost glued to it, there was another article from 1964 mentioning that it had been a year since the discovery of the body, and there was still no clue about the murderer. It was then that I realized something was very strange. I immediately went back to the diary and began to look for the pages corresponding to the time of the events. Only guess what? The pages had been torn out, and the rest of the diary was completely blank. I looked up and then saw my grandmother Alina observing me fixedly. There was a worried expression on her face. "What are you reading, dear?" she asked, her voice slightly trembling. Suddenly, the air around us seemed heavy, dense. Without saying a word, I raised the diary and the newspaper clipping. Her face now showed a deep fear, and her eyes were full of tears. "You shouldn't mess with other people's private things," she said in a low, trembling tone. Without even thinking straight, I asked directly, "What happened, Grandma? What do you have to do with Richard's death?" A heavy silence took over the room, as if the walls were holding an old secret. My grandmother sat in the old rocking chair in front of me, and I could see her hands trembling. "Life sometimes forces us to make difficult decisions, dear, and the past should stay behind," she said. But I couldn't go without answers and insisted, "What do you mean by that? Why have you never talked about this? We always thought he had died of a heart attack. Does Aunt Irma know anything?" She shook her head, her gaze lost in the window, as if trying to recover memories that had been buried a long time ago. "Fear and desperation can make us do terrible things, honey," she whispered. After a silence that seemed to last forever, my grandmother began to tell me how her husband had changed drastically after the marriage. Consumed by his own demons, alcohol had transformed that man into an abusive and violent monster, to the point of almost making her lose her daughter from so many beatings. The arguments and aggressions only got worse over time, until one night he came home drunk as always, and began to shout insults while she was breastfeeding Aunt Irma. She tried to ignore him to avoid another fight, but that only made him more furious. He tore the 1-year-old baby from her arms, holding her by the legs and hanging her upside down from the balcony, threatening to let her fall. When my grandmother told me this, I began to tremble, my stomach tied in a knot. It was hard to believe what she was saying, but I remembered the excerpt from the diary where she talked about the fear she felt for her daughter's life, and I knew it was true. That night, he only returned the girl after she knelt and begged him not to hurt her. But before leaving, he still gave her a few slaps and warned that if she ignored him again, he would cut the throats of both of them. And my grandmother knew he was capable of that, and perhaps worse. So that same night, when he passed out from drinking, she went down to the kitchen, grabbed a meat knife, went up to the bedroom, and stabbed him in the heart 7 times while he slept. It was necessary. In that era, domestic violence was very normalized, and women always ended up losing. So it was his life or ours, and I would never allow him to hurt my daughter. He was a monster and deserved what he got. That's why I don't regret it, not one bit. The silence returned to take over until she continued. I dragged him to the forest far away where I knew no one would find him for a while. She paused for a moment. The only advantage of being a woman years ago was being constantly underestimated. No one believed that a woman was capable of such an act. She looked at me firmly and said, "But a mother is capable of anything to protect her children." The way she said those words made the room seem frozen and gave me chills down my spine. But I understood what she felt. I don't have children, but if someone did that to me and my child, I know I would have done the same. Who would have the right to judge her? After that, I stood up, went to her, and hugged her tightly. I told her that I loved her and that she had been incredibly brave. I also promised that this secret would die with me. That same afternoon, as if it were a silent pact between us, we threw the envelope with everything that was inside into the fireplace, closing forever that dark chapter of her life. My grandmother is the sweetest, most generous, and bravest person I've ever known. And if I already admired her before, now that admiration has only increased. I continue to visit her almost every weekend, but since then, we've never touched on the subject again. We pretend that none of it happened. This is a secret that the two of us will take to our graves. Every summer, my sister Cynthia and I made a point of visiting our grandparents in Colorado. Although they were older and a bit fragile, they were extraordinary people. Grandma Beatrice prepared delicious meals, while Grandpa Joseph tenderly cared for his garden. And of course, there were never a lack of those heavy pranks, buckets of water over the door or doll parts hidden in our guest beds. Even with somewhat delicate health, they maintained a youthful spirit full of life. That's why I was really pleased when they decided to move to a retirement community in San Diego. The warmer climate would do them good, besides giving them new opportunities to socialize and remain active. Last year, we ended up not visiting them because they were still organizing the move. However, this summer, we decided to take a plane to spend an entire week with them. As soon as they met us at the airport, they seemed like different people, much healthier and happier. During the journey to their house, I noticed that Grandpa Joseph started asking some questions. What we ate, how often we exercised, and even if we had a habit of smoking. Cynthia didn't waste time and said that I smoked, but she didn't. My grandparents exchanged looks, like people who really care about maintaining a healthier lifestyle. Arriving at their community, I was amazed by the landscape. The houses were enormous, and the streets had views of the ocean. Neighbors passed by in golf carts, all the age of my grandparents, but with impressive vitality. They smiled and greeted us. Some even invited us to dinner at their homes during our visit. I had a good feeling about this community. If everything was as I imagined, my parents could have a long and happy life there. Maybe even I myself, when my time came to retire. At 25, I already thought it would be an incredible place to live, or at least that's what I thought at that moment. That night I was sleeping deeply when suddenly Cynthia came running into my room and shook me as if something serious had happened. "What's wrong?" I asked. She told me that Grandma Beatrice had entered her room in a rather strange way. I looked at her without really understanding her apprehension and said, "Cynthia, you know how grandparents are sometimes, especially during the night. Maybe she just went to check if you were okay." "You know, Grandma." Cynthia remained silent, but asked if she could sleep in my room. I responded no, because I didn't want to be woken up by her snoring in the morning. The next day, I woke up with a weird sensation, as if something wasn't right. I went to the kitchen to find my grandparents, but I only saw Grandpa Joseph having his breakfast. Cynthia wasn't around. I asked about her and Grandma Beatrice, and then Grandma entered the kitchen, saying for me not to worry, that Cynthia had gone out early, probably to do some exercise. That didn't seem right to me. I knew that my sister never exercised and would never go out in the middle of the night without letting me know. I tried to argue with my grandparents, but Grandpa Joseph just asked me to stop asking silly questions and insisted that I eat with him. I decided not to prolong the conversation and ran straight to Cynthia's room. As soon as I entered, I realized that her bed was impeccably made, something rare. Soon I noticed that her suitcase wasn't there, and the window of the room was wide open, which was very strange for her. Making sure that my grandparents weren't around, I escaped through the window and saw fresh marks on the ground, seeming like tracks of something dragged. I followed the signals to the community center that was a bit further down the street. On the way, I passed by an elderly lady watering her garden, who asked me how I was. "Fine," I responded, trying to sound natural and avoid suspicion. I noticed that she was looking at me in a strange way, but I continued on my way to the center. Upon arriving, I found the door open and went in. I came across a room that appeared to be a kind of improvised infirmary, full of medical equipment and operating tables. In the center of the space, I saw Cynthia tied to a table. She had a gag and could barely move. Quickly, I removed the gag and asked what was happening. "Help me," she whispered. "I think they took my kidney." I noticed that her shirt was soaked with blood. When I lifted it, I saw an ugly, recently stitched scar on her side, still with blood. "Help me, Alex. These elderly people are kidnapping young people like us to steal organs. You have to stop Grandma and Grandpa," she murmured with a weak voice before fainting. At that moment, the terrible truth hit me hard. This wasn't a simple retirement community. All these elderly people kept themselves in good shape because they were stealing organs. And the most terrifying thing was knowing that my own grandparents were part of this. I tried to untie the straps from Cynthia, but the straps were firmly tied to her wrists. I finally managed to free one of her hands, but soon I heard slow clapping behind me. Turning around, I saw my grandmother watching me with a sinister smile. That smile seemed out of the ordinary. "Look who we have here. You're smarter than I imagined," she said. "Are you really stealing organs?" I asked as the discomfort grew within me. Soon 2 more elderly people entered the room, and behind them, Grandpa Joseph, who remained silent. "It's for a greater cause, dear. Don't worry, Cynthia will be fine. You can live perfectly well with just 1 kidney." My grandmother Beatrice responded, still with that fixed smile on her face. "Your grandmother is right, Alex. Now let's go home." I looked at Cynthia, who remained motionless and now seemed to have even more blood on her clothing. "My God, she's bleeding out." "No, that's normal," said my grandmother without showing any concern. Cynthia opened her eyes and tried to say something, but no sound came out. Then Grandpa approached, slid his finger over her open wound, and then licked the blood from the tip of his finger. "Delicious," he murmured, laughing. At that moment, terror took hold of me. I really didn't understand what was happening, but it was at least suspicious to see all these elderly people with impeccable health and so active. The answer was clear. They were stealing organs to maintain this vitality. At that moment, 4 more neighbors entered the room, exhibiting the same disturbing smile as my grandparents. "Are all of you in on this?" I managed to ask, and my question only made them laugh even more. It seemed that they were all under the effect of some strange substance. Suddenly, these elderly people began to surround me, while Cynthia woke up desperate, whispering for me to get out of there as quickly as possible. But there was nowhere to run. Then my grandfather began to circle the room with that fixed and sinister smile, approaching me slowly. I saw when he put his hand in his jacket pocket, and when he removed it, he was holding a huge knife with blood marks. At that moment, Cynthia began to scream, and I, in desperation, asked aloud, "What's happening?" "We're your grandchildren. You watched us grow up. We're your family. Why are you doing this?" My grandfather took a few more steps and stopped less than 6 feet from me. Then he raised the knife, looked into my eyes, and said, "You know why we do this, little Alex?" "Why?" I asked, terrified. "Because it's so much fun to see your face when you fall for our pranks." And he began to laugh, accompanied by my grandmother, the other elderly people, and finally the traitor Cynthia, who got up from the stretcher, contorting with laughter. I couldn't believe how naive I had been. I should have suspected that my grandparents were planning something, but the execution was so well done that I fell for it completely. I don't know who took the trouble to make up Cynthia, but the blood and wounds seemed absurdly real. Seriously, I almost lost control there. At the beginning, I was furious, and my first reaction was to stomp out, but my grandfather held me, hugging me from behind and apologizing for the prank, even while still laughing nonstop. Why couldn't I have more normal grandparents? The most unbelievable thing is that all the other elderly people also participated in the prank, laughing and applauding as if they were teenagers. But after a while, I finally calmed down, and the timing couldn't have been better, since one of the elderly people was having a birthday and invited us to the party. In the end, my grandparents' prank became the main topic of the night, and we ended up having a lot of fun. I discovered that the good health and physical shape of most of these grandparents were really the result of a more active and healthy lifestyle, enthusiastically encouraged by the community. along with some natural treatments that rejuvenated the body. Thank goodness it was that, and not organ theft. My name is Gabriella, and I'm from India, though I've lived in the United States since I was 13 years old. This story happened in my native country during my elementary school days, some years before I moved here. I had a friend who lived very close by, and we went to school together every day. One day, as usual, I waited in front of her house, but soon realized something was strange. When she came out, she seemed lost, a bit off. Getting closer, I noticed she was sweating and had a weird expression, as if she was disturbed by something. I asked what was happening, and she began to tell me about some strange dreams she had been having for a while. During the nights, she dreamed of a kind elderly woman who appeared frequently. This woman prepared delicious foods and ate everything right in front of her. My friend had several conversations with the old woman because that figure brought her a good and welcoming feeling. The most curious thing was that upon waking up, she felt full, as if she had really eaten, although everything had just been a dream. At that time, she lived only with her maternal grandmother, just the two of them in the house. But one day, right before she left for school, her grandmother, with a frightened look, begged her not to follow anyone unknown or any person who tried to approach her. My friend, somewhat confused, tried to reassure her, saying that everything would be fine, and went to school. In truth, nothing strange happened during the day. So that night, she went to sleep as usual. When she fell asleep again, the elderly woman reappeared in her dream, and there they were, enjoying another meal. But then suddenly, the elderly woman asked her to accompany her to another place. My friend, without hesitation, held her hand and began to follow her. But in an instant, she remembered the warnings that her grandmother had given that morning. She released the elderly woman's hand and refused to go. At this moment, she saw the woman's face change and become frightening, almost like a witch, a spectral and terrifying figure. Before she could understand what was happening, the elderly woman grabbed her by the nape of her neck and began to drag her. As much as she tried to get loose, her body remained motionless while fear completely dominated her. Amid this terror, she remembered one more thing that her grandmother had told her that morning. If one day someone tries to drag you in a dream, don't panic. Just hit your head against something solid like a wall or a pillar, and you will wake up quickly. She saw a tree ahead and decided to try to hit her head against it. But suddenly, the elderly woman began to laugh, still pulling her by the head. "Who told you that?" she asked in a mocking tone. "As I know. It was your grandmother." With this, my friend couldn't wake up and realized she was being taken deeper and deeper into that dream. Then her gaze fell on the staff that the elderly woman held. Without thinking twice, she struck with all her strength and bam. She finally awoke from that frightening nightmare. I still get goosebumps when I remember her words while she told me this story. A few days later, early in the morning, I realized that my friend was so shaken by the dream that she began to miss school. The situation seemed serious, so I decided to go to her house because I was very worried. When I arrived there, the door was locked, and she wasn't answering her phone. It was only after a month that I finally received a call from her asking me to go to her house again. With my heart divided between anxiety, fear, and a bit of curiosity. I went there as quickly as possible. When I found her, she seemed like another person, weak, almost unrecognizable. The environment there was strange, and a heavy sensation filled the air. I could even hear her laughing alone, with a disconcerting and meaningless laugh. Suddenly she pulled me inside, guiding me to a room, and with a strange tone said, "Look, my grandmother is crazy." Her laughter echoed even louder, as if something had broken inside her. I couldn't avoid it and looked at the room. There was her grandmother, sitting with her gaze lost in emptiness, visibly desperate in a dark environment, illuminated only by the light that came through the window. Her face reflected a deep terror, while she murmured repeated phrases with no apparent sense. "I didn't teach that. It wasn't me. Forgive me," she repeatedly said. Soon after, I found out that my friend's grandmother had passed away. My friend, in turn, ended up being admitted to a psychiatric center because she began to have hallucinations and seemed completely disconnected from reality. It was as if she had suddenly gone crazy. At the time, at 11 years old, this only made me think of one thing. Her grandmother was a witch who invaded her dreams and gave her something harmful to eat. I thought the final intention was to devour her. But now, as an adult and a psychology student, I wonder if there was an underlying mental problem in the family. Analyzing her and her grandmother's behavior, it's possible that it was schizophrenia, perhaps even aggravated by some substance that the grandmother might have put in her food. Who knows? The truth is that I never saw my friend again after that. A few years later, I ended up emigrating to this country. And since then, whenever I talk with relatives in India, I ask about her. However, to this day, no one knows what happened to her. I have over 15 years of experience in the entertainment universe, and although I don't work directly under the spotlight, it's still a thrill to be immersed in this world. My role is essentially to plan and set up scenography for theatrical plays, dance performances, as well as films and music videos. The mission is to ensure that each element on stage is exactly where it should be for each production. Like many of my colleagues, my interest in scenic art began early, and in my case, perhaps even earlier than many of them. I believe there's something familial about this passion, since my grandfather was a producer in the 1950s and worked alongside big stars like Gary Cooper and even Frank Sinatra. During my childhood, he would entertain me, my brother, and all our cousins with incredible stories from that glorious era of Hollywood and Broadway. Over the years, I noticed that my grandmother always reacted strangely when he recalled his times in the industry. After he passed away, as adults, my brother and I remembered these moments and began to notice the discomfort she displayed when the subject came up. We conjectured a bit, and as painful as it was, we considered the possibility that during that golden era of cinema, perhaps my grandfather had lived through some adventures. The way my grandmother changed when hearing these stories was, at the very least, intriguing. It was enough for him to recall some anecdotes from those times, and she already adopted a loaded expression, as if reliving unwanted memories. It didn't seem fair to presume that he really had extramarital involvements, but it was difficult not to consider this hypothesis when imagining those crazy times in the industry. almost like the Wild West, but filled with parties and stunning women around every corner. My grandfather was a renowned producer, which meant he had close contact with some of the most famous and beautiful actresses of his time. As uncomfortable as it was to think about, the idea that he might have gotten involved with some celebrity seemed to make sense. Sometime after his death, following a long battle against cancer, I went to visit my grandmother, and for the first time, I gathered the courage to ask the truth about my grandfather's years as a producer in Hollywood. I didn't want to hear those fabulous, glamour-filled stories that he always shared when we touched on the subject. I wanted to know what actually happened behind the scenes, especially now that I myself was part of this world and already knew a bit about the less rosy side that surrounds it. The entertainment industry is full of vices and temptations. Most people don't even imagine what goes on, and from what I know in those times, everything seemed to be amplified to the maximum. However, I needed to be careful. The last thing I wanted was to bring up memories that might be painful for my grandmother. I knew how much she continued to show affection and sincere admiration for him until the last moment, which made it strange to think that he might have betrayed that trust so deeply. So I decided to ask the question indirectly. Why did Grandpa leave Hollywood? And why did you always leave the room when he talked about those times? My grandmother remained silent for a few seconds. Then she took a deep breath and answered, "Well, I think you're mature enough to hear this story." I became even more curious, so I just nodded and prepared to listen attentively. She began to narrate everything in that typical grandmotherly way. And soon I realized that I was completely wrong about what I had imagined she would say. She didn't remember the exact year, but she recounted that at some point in my grandfather's career as a producer, he decided to take her to Hollywood. This was something I had no idea about. At the time, she was about 23 years old and was a Broadway dancer, really very beautiful. My grandfather took advantage of his contacts to get some auditions for her and introduced her to influential people in the city. But being very proud, my grandmother didn't want anything to be facilitated for her. So she adopted a different surname and never mentioned that she was the wife of a producer at the auditions. She wanted to conquer her space through talent, not through her husband's name. After several frustrating attempts, she was almost ready to abandon the dream of being a film actress. She thought that perhaps it would be better to continue her career as a dancer or maybe try her luck as a model. After all, she had the attributes for that. Still, before giving up completely, she decided to participate in one last audition that promised to be her big break in cinema. According to her, my grandfather was quite skeptical about it, as he had never heard of the director or the project. But my grandmother, with her usual stubbornness, asked him to trust her and assured him that she knew what she was doing. The audition location was an old building in ruins on the outskirts of the city. Probably disoriented, she didn't pay much attention to the suspicious location, thinking that the director might have chosen that place for artistic reasons, or perhaps had his office there. As soon as she entered, she encountered something frightening. 4 people, 3 women and 1 man, all wearing masks. When she tried to run, she was immediately grabbed by 2 of the women, who began to assault her. In a short time, they tied her to a chair, and one of the women warned that if she wanted to leave there alive, she would have to collaborate. If she refused, the situation would get complicated. Seeing that she didn't have many alternatives, my grandmother agreed, hoping that she would find a chance to escape later on. The woman explained that they needed her to rob a place, and that they would wait for her outside the building. If she tried to scream or run away, they would make sure to find her. They told her the entire plan, and my grandmother pretended not to understand very well, realizing that this might be her only way out. She imagined that upon entering the apartment, she might find a phone to call someone, or, even better, find someone willing to help her. However, when they arrived at the building where they would carry out the robbery, her plan crumbled completely. One of the men escorted her, and she noticed that he carried a metal tube in his hands. Chills ran down her spine as she thought that the object was a veiled threat. The door to the apartment was open, and they entered. They gave her a cloth sack and asked her to fill it with cash. They assured her that she would find money on a table inside, and in fact, they were right. With her heart racing, my grandmother began to fill the bag with money, trying at the same time to figure out a way to escape. Suddenly, the man pushed her and shouted for her to hurry up. While continuing, she noticed a vase of flowers on the table, and on impulse, she grabbed the object and hit it hard on the subject's head, who fell unconscious to the floor. She took advantage of the chance and ran toward the exit at the back of the building. Feeling that she could finally breathe, she ran for several blocks until she spotted a police car in a parking lot. She quickly approached and told the police officer what had happened. However, at that time, it seemed that the authorities didn't give much importance to women, and it took a while for them to take her story seriously. In the end, they called my grandfather, who decided to avoid any scandal. Fortunately, my grandmother was able to give a very detailed description of the kidnappers, which led to the arrest of one of the women in the group. But the other three ended up escaping. She never knew who the owner of the apartment was, but from what she heard, it must have been someone involved in the darker sides of Hollywood, especially after the arrested woman revealed that the plan was to kill her at the location after filling the bag with money. The idea was that everything would remain without a trace, as if nothing had happened. They didn't imagine that she would manage to escape, much less that she was married to someone influential. For them, she was just a young dancer, another victim in the cruel trap of the show. The trauma was so deep that my grandmother decided that she would not remain one more second in that city. She returned to her parents' home, and a few months later, my grandfather also abandoned Hollywood to go after her. That's how they started their family together. It's curious to think that he always told us stories full of humor and joy. But when talking about Hollywood, she could barely disguise the terrifying memories. I can't imagine what she must have felt at that horrible moment, and I'm grateful that she managed to escape and still see a small justice with the capture of one of the culprits. I hope the others were caught later on, and that in the end, justice came for them too. It's incredible how, in a matter of moments, life can change, and how some unscrupulous people can destroy others' dreams. What I'm about to share happened when I was just a child, so some details might be a bit fuzzy, but the most important parts remain etched in my memory. I grew up in rural Minnesota, where endless fields stretched as far as the eye could see. Every day, I rode my bike to school because my parents worked long hours, making it the most practical option for everyone. We lived in a remote area surrounded by farmland, and my route to school passed by a vast cornfield. Looking back, maybe it wasn't actually that enormous, but to a 9-year-old, it seemed infinite. Our house stood on the opposite side of this field, and my parents had one unwavering rule: never cut through the cornfield. Stay on the main road, they'd insist, fear creeping into their voices. They worried I'd get lost without a phone to call for help. I never questioned this rule. I'd witnessed firsthand how easy it was to lose your way in that sea of cornstalks, where everything looked identical. So day after day, I dutifully pedaled around the perimeter, taking the longer route. Since we lived so remotely, I didn't have many friends nearby. My daily rides were solitary affairs, but I didn't mind. In fact, over time, I grew to love biking. On weekends, even when I didn't need to go anywhere, I'd grab my bicycle and ride for hours, exploring the countryside. I don't remember exactly what day it was, a Tuesday maybe, but it was definitely a school day, because I was heading home in the late afternoon. The air had that particular autumn crispness, and the sun was beginning its lazy descent toward the horizon. I was following my usual route when disaster struck. My bike chain completely derailed. I have no idea how it happened, but the chain came off entirely, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't get it back on the gears. My dad had taught me basic bike maintenance, but nothing was working this time. I was stranded, and the thought of walking the entire way home with my bike in tow seemed absolutely dreadful. In those days, kids didn't have cell phones. I couldn't just call my parents for help, and accepting a ride from a stranger was absolutely out of the question. It was just me and my broken bicycle in the gathering dusk. That's when I looked at the cornfield. Following the normal path would take forever, but cutting through the cornfield would save me at least 30 minutes. I knew my parents had forbidden me from entering, but I reasoned it wouldn't be that complicated to navigate. After all, how hard could it be to walk in a straight line? I decided to risk it, pushing my bike into the cornfield and repeating to myself that it would be a quick shortcut. At first, everything seemed fine. The path between the corn rows was narrow, but clear enough to pass through. The cornstalks towered around me, and I remember a light breeze rustling the leaves. For a child walking through a cornfield, the plants seemed 10 times taller than they actually were, making everything around me feel enormous and slightly threatening. Soon, an uncomfortable feeling began to creep over me. The corn blocked much of the sunlight, casting strange, shifting shadows, and the silence was eerie and absolute. Occasionally, I glanced over my shoulder, though I couldn't explain what exactly was frightening me. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. After a few minutes, I noticed a faint rustling sound coming from the plants a little way ahead. I stopped and listened, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, but it didn't sound like wind at all. The noise stopped, but as soon as I started walking again, I heard it once more, now slightly louder and closer. I thought perhaps an animal was following me, but I couldn't imagine what kind of creature would make so much noise. My breathing became shallow, and I deeply regretted entering the cornfield. I quickened my pace, still unwilling to abandon my bike, and tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. But every few minutes, the rustling would return, as if something was stalking me through the rows of corn. At some point, the rustling stopped, and I felt enormous relief. Maybe 10 minutes passed without any strange sounds. At the next fork in the rows, I decided to change direction just to be safe. I turned a corner, and there, in the middle of the path, stood a man. He was completely motionless, arms hanging loosely at his sides, just staring at me. He didn't look like a farmer or anyone who belonged there. His clothes were filthy and torn, and he had strange, long marks on his arms, deep scratches that seemed carved into his skin. His face was gaunt, with sunken eyes that never blinked as they fixed on me. I froze, unable to decide what to do, until he spoke. He asked in a low, raspy voice if I was lost. I couldn't answer. I was paralyzed with fear. Then he took a step toward me and said he would help me find my way home. It felt like sleep paralysis. I simply couldn't move. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. He began approaching more quickly, his hands stretching toward me, and that's when my body finally reacted. I dropped my bicycle and ran as fast as I could. He started chasing me, shouting that he only wanted to help. I continued running without looking back, hearing him crashing through the corn behind me, yelling for me to stop. Occasionally, I duck between the corn rows and curl up, trying to make myself as small as possible, with my eyes tightly shut. The truth is, I thought I was going to die. He was carrying something that looked like rope, and he kept muttering to himself, "I'll find you." I'll never forget those words as long as I live. I remained hidden for what seemed like an eternity. My legs were cramping, and my entire body was shaking, but I didn't dare move until I was certain he was gone. When I finally crawled out of the cornfield and found my way back to the road, I was trembling so badly I could hardly walk. Night had fallen completely. Somehow I made it home and ran straight into my parents' arms. They were frantic, worried sick about where I'd been. I told them everything. My mother dissolved into tears, and my father looked ready to confront whoever it was. But there wasn't much to be done. The man had long since disappeared. My father went out to search for my bicycle, but couldn't find it anywhere. They bought me a new one a few days later, and life went on. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened that made us move away. I came home from school and saw my old bicycle sitting on our front porch, the very same one I had abandoned in the cornfield. To this day, I don't know who was more terrified, me or my parents. They no longer felt safe with me in that house, so shortly afterward, we moved away. My parents rarely talk about what happened, but I know I'll never forget. I want to share a disturbing experience that happened to me about 3 years ago. I was 28 at the time and trying to realize my dream of becoming a writer. I'd been working for a popular magazine in Chicago, but things hadn't gone as planned. After a series of rejections and a particularly brutal round of layoffs, I found myself heading back to my childhood home in eastern Nebraska to help my aging parents with our family farm. It wasn't exactly what I had envisioned for myself when I'd left home years earlier with a head full of ambitions and a heart full of determination. But my parents were getting older, and managing the place on their own was becoming increasingly difficult. I told myself it would be temporary, just until I found my footing again. The farm was quiet and isolated, surrounded by extensive cornfields that stretched for miles in every direction. Our nearest neighbor lived about a 15-minute walk away on a small farm. She'd been managing alone since her husband passed away several years before. Life there moved at a glacial pace, but I didn't mind at that point. A slower rhythm was exactly what I needed. The first few weeks were fairly normal. I was beginning to adapt to the routine of managing a farm, and the more tranquil pace was actually doing me good. I had plenty of free time to reflect and write, which I typically did during the nights. I'm not sure why, but I've always been more creative and productive after dark. I'd finish the farm chores before sunset, then spend hours at my computer until exhaustion finally overtook me. I chose a small room on the third floor of the house as my workspace to avoid disturbing my parents with my different sleep schedule. I liked that space. It was cozy and quiet, and the window offered an inspiring view of the farmland. But after about another week, I began to notice something strange. Every night, just before sunset, I would see a figure standing at the distant edge of my parents' cornfield, between two rows of corn. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I assumed it was someone from the neighboring farm, perhaps checking their lands or inspecting the crops. The person wasn't exactly on my parents' property, so it wasn't trespassing or anything illegal, but it was odd. The figure remained motionless, making no gestures, just standing there almost like a scarecrow or mannequin. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman. In fact, I couldn't even tell if they were facing toward me or away. It was unsettling, but I tried to convince myself there was no cause for concern. Despite the strangeness of it all, I noticed the scene would make for a great photograph. A silhouette contrasting against the golden twilight sky and the seemingly endless cornfields. I even considered taking my camera out there one evening to capture it. A few days passed, and the figure continued to appear, always around the same time and in the same spot, just standing there. One night, I decided to observe more carefully to make sure it wasn't actually a scarecrow. I finally noticed it was moving slightly, which confirmed it was indeed a real person. It was weird, but I continued trying to convince myself that it was nothing to worry about. I even thought it might be the neighbor, the elderly lady my mother mentioned frequently since I'd returned. I hadn't seen her yet, but maybe she had some reason to approach our property. After all, what kind of problem could an elderly lady possibly cause for my parents or their property? Of course, if that were the case, I probably wouldn't even be writing about this now. Looking back, I was remarkably naive to be so unconcerned about the situation. Things began to change in the days that followed. The figure started to appear in different positions each night, always between two different rows of corn, and always a little closer to the house. They remained quiet and motionless, but they were certainly advancing night after night, and I was sure of it. Still, it was impossible to make out any details about them at that distance, but it was evident the situation was getting serious. Whoever was out there seemed determined to get progressively closer to our property. After 2 nights of watching this happen, I decided something needed to be done. The next morning, I told my parents about what I'd been observing for the past few weeks. My mother didn't pay much attention, saying it was probably the neighbor's son, who had always been a bit eccentric. According to her, calling him eccentric was a euphemism, but my mother always had a gentle way of putting things. To my surprise, they didn't seem either concerned or bothered. They simply said I should leave him alone, as he posed no danger whatsoever. One night, while working late in the barn, I looked toward the edge of the field and felt my stomach drop. The figure was no longer at the distant edge of the cornfield, but standing very close to our property line, much closer than before. A chill ran through my body. I wiped my hands on my jeans, and feeling a mix of nervousness and frustration, decided to approach. I needed to see better who this was. I walked up to the boundary of the field and called out, "Who's there?" But as I approached, the figure turned and ran into a corn row. I pursued, but as I turned the corner, I saw they had literally vanished among the plants, disappearing from my sight. My heart was racing as I scanned the surrounding field, but I knew it would make no sense to try to search for them blindly in the middle of that cornfield. By this point, I was genuinely frightened. Even if it was just some mischievous kid, the idea of having someone so close to our house no longer left me at ease. The following morning, I went to the neighbor's farm to try to clear things up. The elderly lady answered the door, and I went straight to the point without beating around the bush. She seemed genuinely confused as I told her what was happening. She slowly shook her head and told me she hadn't left the house after nightfall for weeks because of her fragile health. She explained she could barely move around, let alone walk all the way to the edge of her property. So I asked about her son, but she said he had left home years ago and hadn't lived with her since then. I froze as she told me this. I felt my skin crawl. Whoever I had chased the night before wasn't her son. It was a complete stranger. I left her house with a growing sense of apprehension. Whoever or whatever was prowling around the cornfield definitely wasn't coming from her farm. I told my parents everything as soon as I got home, and now they were concerned too. My mother suggested calling the police, but my father thought it would be a waste of time since they hadn't done anything illegal. He instructed me to stay awake and wake him if the stranger appeared again, and I agreed. For the next few days, nothing happened. It was as if the figure had vanished, and that was a relief. Perhaps they had seen me talking to the neighbor, or simply decided not to return after the chase. Either way, I was more at ease. Later that week, I was in the barn finishing some tasks when suddenly everything went dark. And when I say dark, I mean total blackness. The entire farm was plunged into darkness without any warning, as if the power had disappeared in the blink of an eye. All the lights inside and outside the house went out. I never took my phone with me to the barn, so I was completely blind. My heart raced as I had the uncomfortable feeling I knew what had caused the blackout. I fumbled in the dark until I found a flashlight I remembered was nearby. With it in hand, I ran out of the barn toward the house. But I stopped midway. I wanted to go straight inside, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. I decided to circle around to check the electrical panel. But then I heard something, a soft rustling coming from the cornfield. That's when I realized that person was on our property, just a few meters away from me. I turned slowly and pointed the flashlight toward the field, trying not to make noise. For a moment, everything remained as it was, just the sound of rustling in the middle of the corn. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a movement. With my heart racing, I pointed the trembling light in that direction. There, just a few meters from the barn, stood a man. Now I could see him clearly. It was a man with few strands of hair on an almost bald head. He wore overalls and stared at me fixedly with a threatening expression. I looked at his hands. He was holding a rusty garden hoe. Fear overtook me, and I took off running. To my horror, I heard his footsteps behind me. I ran into the cornfield, hoping he would get lost in there. I looked back and saw him running full speed in my direction. I turned a corner, and before he could see me, I fell and hid between the corn rows. I stayed there with my heart beating frantically, trying to contain the sound of my breathing. A few seconds passed before he ran by close to me. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. I wanted to run back to get my phone and call the police, but fear paralyzed me. I remained silent for several minutes, thinking about the situation and reflecting on everything. Finally, I left my hiding place and ran back to the house, which was still plunged in total darkness. I called the police and woke up my parents. The police searched the property but found nothing. However, they identified the cause of the blackout. Someone had poured a bucket of water on the electrical panel, causing everything to shut down. The next day, I helped my parents install some extra security measures and even went to the neighbor's house to warn her to be careful. I stayed at the farm for another month, but nothing else happened during that period. Leaving my parents alone on the farm with someone dangerous on the loose broke my heart. But I needed to move on with my life. They hired a helper to take care of the tasks, so I wasn't really needed anymore. This was, without a doubt, the strangest and most disturbing experience I've ever had. It's something I still think about often, wondering who that man was and what his intentions might have been. I recently moved to rural Vermont to disconnect from everything for a while. I'm now working a job with no great prospects, but it pays enough to live comfortably, so I'm content. I don't plan to stay here forever, but the peace and quiet of this place have been good for my mental health. As you might imagine, there are plenty of agricultural lands nearby. This rural setting isn't exactly my natural habitat, coming from Boston and all, but I'm gradually getting used to it. About 4 months ago, I found a simple little house with surprisingly affordable rent. Despite being small, the property was quite spacious, with a large yard that I had no idea what to do with. I'm not sure if it was previously a farm or had been abandoned, but there was an immense cornfield right next to the house. The field extended to a wooden fence so close to the house that I could almost touch both the fence and the wall simultaneously. As you can probably guess, I didn't have any neighbors for miles. As strange as it may seem, I enjoyed this isolation. I found it oddly comforting. Sometimes during the night, I would stand by the window gazing at the cornfield, contemplating life while the wind gently swayed the stalks. Perhaps I would have stayed in that house for much longer if it weren't for what I'm about to tell you. One October night, one of those cold, windy ones, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay in a warm room looking out at the wind through the window. Actually, I like being outside during times like these. I'm a bit strange that way. There's something about putting my hands in my jacket pockets in the cold that brings me a good feeling. That night, I was on the back porch, smoking a cigarette and observing the yard before heading inside. I was just about to finish when I heard something, a scream. This wasn't the kind of distant animal cry you sometimes hear in the countryside. This was different, a sharp, cutting sound that was unmistakably human. It sounded like it came from a child, perhaps a young boy. The sound echoed from the cornfield behind the house. Without thinking much, I rushed inside, grabbed my hunting rifle, and went back outside. I don't know exactly what came over me, but I couldn't ignore the possibility of a child in danger. As I ran toward the cornfield, the scream sounded again, now louder and more desperate. I stopped midway, looked around, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. I called out to the child, asking them to scream again so I could find them. But there was no response, only silence. With adrenaline pumping through my veins, I jumped the fence and chose a corn row at random, advancing with the weak flashlight from my phone to guide me. I continued calling out, but the child never responded. At some point, I realized the situation was beyond what I could handle alone. I called the police and explained what I had heard, then went back to wait for them to arrive. When the officers got there, I insisted on accompanying them in the search through the field. They agreed, and I was grateful. We searched for at least half an hour, calling for the child the entire time, but no response ever came. There was nothing there, no footprints, no signs of movement, not a single indication that anyone had passed through that field. Finally, we gave up. The police advised me to call again if I heard anything more and left. I felt frustrated, but what else could I do? Part of me thought that maybe it was just a prank, which almost made sense. After all, the kids around here must do what they can to occupy their time. Still, the idea of someone playing with something like this made me sick. Despite trying to convince myself it was just a prank, after that incident, I couldn't relax anymore. Little did I know that this was just the beginning, and things were about to go from 0 to 100 really fast. I was upstairs getting ready for bed when something outside the window caught my attention. It was exactly the kind of thing no one wants to see from their bedroom window. A faint orange glow. I rushed to the window and felt my stomach drop. In the distance, small flames were rising in the cornfield, flickering intensely in the darkness. I remember muttering, "Oh my God," repeatedly. I knew I needed to act. The fire was still small, but with the wind blowing outside, it could spread quickly. I ran down the stairs while calling 911, almost shouting into the phone. I grabbed the hose at the side of the house, turned it on, jumped the fence, and ran to the field, hoping the hose would be long enough. I was completely soaked by the time I reached the focus of the fire, but that didn't matter. I knew the firefighters would take forever to get there. I was the only hope. I sprayed water on the flames as much as I could, trying to contain the fire. Fortunately, it didn't spread faster than I could handle, and I managed to put it out completely in a few minutes. As I bent over to catch my breath, thinking, why the hell is this happening to me? I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. When I turned, I nearly felt my heart stop. There was someone at the upstairs window in my bedroom. Without thinking, I dropped the hose, which was still gushing water, and ran back to the house. I flung open the door and entered the kitchen, but stopped immediately, frozen in place. The living room was ransacked. The refrigerator and cabinets were all open, and a good portion of the dishes was broken on the floor. It was a chaotic scene, and I didn't know what to think. I hardly had time to process everything when I heard the front door slam. I turned and ran to the door, but by the time I got there, whoever had been inside was already gone. I went outside again, but there was no one in sight. I didn't have the energy to chase anyone. In fact, I thought I might pass out from the chaos I had just experienced. A few minutes later, the police and firefighters finally arrived. I explained the situation, and this time they took everything much more seriously. Attempted arson is a serious crime, and they treated it as such. Several other officers appeared and even brought tracking dogs to do a detailed search. But once again, they found nothing. It was clear that whoever did this had had time to escape on foot. For several weeks, I couldn't sleep properly. Every creak, every sound in the middle of the night left me on high alert. Every night, I slept with my hunting rifle on the floor beside me, until the moment I could finally move out. I kept trying to understand what had happened, but nothing made sense. What disturbed me most was that first scream. It turns my stomach to think there might actually have been a child in danger, less than 100 yards from me. The police never found any leads. No suspects, no evidence beyond what had been done to my house that night. I did eventually move, finding a small apartment in a more populated area where I felt safer. When I tell people this story, they often ask if I think the two incidents, the scream and the fire, were connected. I'm almost certain they were, and that's what makes it so terrifying. Someone deliberately lured me away from my house, setting a small fire as a distraction to break in. What I don't understand is why they would choose such an isolated house with seemingly nothing of value. And why, if robbery was the goal, they left so much chaos without taking anything significant. Sometimes I wonder if it was all a sick game to someone, the ultimate prank on the city guy who moved to the country. But deep down, I know it was something far more sinister. The calculated nature of it all suggests someone with truly malicious intent. I still occasionally have nightmares about that child's scream echoing through the cornfield. In my darkest moments, I wonder if there ever was a child at all, or if that too was just part of the twisted plan to draw me out of my house that night. Good evening to whoever might read this. My name is Sophia, and my late husband James was the best thing that ever happened to me. To summarize briefly, he died 9 years ago in a motorcycle accident. As I write this on April 29th, 2023, what I'm about to share is something I've blocked from my mind since then. But I think I'm finally ready to talk about it. James and I grew up in Northern California, and Spanish is actually my second language. He always had a dream of visiting Greece, but we postponed the trip numerous times. One of my biggest regrets is not making time during one of our summers to travel there with him. In the spring of 2022, I decided to face it and take the trip he had always wanted to make. At just 36, and with no children, the idea of traveling alone didn't excite me much. So I booked a cruise, believing it would be a more relaxed way to make the journey. I was fortunate. Celebrity Cruise Line offered a cruise called The Best of Greece, which included 6 cities, Athens, Santorini, Ephesus, Mykonos, Volos, Thessaloniki, and back to Athens. I made an effort to enjoy the cruise, knowing that's what he would have wanted for me. But melancholy was always present. It was strange being there without him. Perhaps I overdid it with the wine on the first night after we left Athens, but I felt I could allow myself to be a little reckless. As soon as I disembarked to explore what the city had to offer, I found myself downing martini after martini at a nameless bar. It was there that I noticed him across the room, a man of about 40, with long, straight brown hair and a somewhat disheveled beard. He actually had an interesting appearance, but his gaze was disturbing. Initially, I perceived it as the casual look of a lonely man. Perhaps he found me attractive. I wouldn't have minded if he wanted to look at me a bit. However, after we exchanged glances a few more times, the discomfort began to grow. The intensity with which he stared at me was destabilizing. There was nothing seductive or charming about it, as if he were trying to flirt. It was more like he was trying to bore a hole in my face with his eyes. After finishing what was probably my 8th drink, I paid my bill and quickly returned to the ship. That night, all memory of that man disappeared from my mind. The cruise's next stop was Ephesus. I spent my time there similarly, consuming much more alcohol than recommended for someone my age. Except for a small guilt that bothered me, everything went well in Ephesus. Mykonos was the next stop. I imagine that at this point, this won't surprise anyone. But near the end of the day, there I was, inevitably sitting alone at an outdoor bar when I saw him again. A man was leaning against a lamppost with his arms crossed. I strained my vision, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me, but it was unmistakable. It was the same man I had seen in Santorini. He was too far away for me to know if he was watching me, but his head was tilted in my direction. The strangest thing was that he was wearing exactly the same clothes as before. A sense of discomfort enveloped me. Was I being followed? My hands began to sweat, and I nervously rubbed them on my dress, lowering my head to avoid looking in his direction. Still, his presence seemed to radiate to where I was sitting. I couldn't resist and looked again, but he had already vanished. Perhaps you'd think I would feel relief, but in reality, my anxiety increased. I began to frantically look around, trying to see if he had moved closer. I wasn't comfortable returning to the ship alone, so I approached a couple who were also leaving. I exchanged a few words with them and followed them back in their company. That night, instead of going straight to my cabin, I decided to explore the ship, hoping to find that mysterious man. I searched every corner, and late at night, around midnight, I finally gave up. The next morning, I disembarked in Volos, determined to solve this puzzle. Instead of exploring the city, I chose to wait on the walkway, carefully observing person after person descending from the ship. I didn't let a single face pass by, but he wasn't among the passengers. Frustrated, I returned to the ship and spent the rest of the day by the pool, trying to relax. Thessaloniki was the last stop. Although I was apprehensive, I needed to accept the fact that I was wasting my vacation if I stayed on the boat. So even reluctantly, I went down and tried to enjoy the city. Maybe out of superstition, I decided to avoid bars and drinks this time, which I adhered to. Instead, I wandered aimlessly through the streets, admiring the architecture and enjoying the climate. And then, as if it were programmed, he appeared again. He was a few streets away, standing in the middle of the road with his arms hanging by his sides. Instead of fear, I felt a wave of courage wash over me, probably fueled by the adrenaline taking control. I shouted at him and began to walk in his direction. Instead of responding, he turned and ran. It was surreal. He turned a corner, and I went after him. Upon reaching the corner, I still saw him turning another street, and I continued to pursue him. But when I made the last turn, he had vanished without a trace, as if he had dissolved into thin air. That night, sleep didn't come. When the ship finally docked in Athens, I felt relief. But upon returning home, the uneasiness about that man continued to torment me. I took out my laptop and began to do some searches. I didn't know exactly what to look for, but I imagined recent police reports might be a good starting point. With no significant results, I ended up coming across some missing persons advertisements. I scrolled through several pages until something caught my attention. There, right in the middle of the page, was a poster of a missing person who looked almost identical to the man who had been following me. I was paralyzed, overwhelmed by shock. What made it all even more disturbing was his name. He had the same name as my husband, James. A cruel coincidence that left me feeling groundless. My first reaction was to call the police and report what I had seen. The attendant thanked me for the information and asked me to hold the line. After a few minutes, she asked if I was absolutely certain of what I had seen. I confirmed with certainty. After an uncomfortable pause, she explained that the case of that man had been closed a little over a month before. He had been found dead in a boating accident off the coast of Parga, Greece. The most sinister detail, however, was that the official date of death coincided exactly with the month and day my husband had died, just 2 years later. I hung up the phone, literally trembling. I can't remember a time when I felt so much fear. I began to feel dizzy, questioning if I was losing my sanity, or if somehow I had imagined it all. Then another realization hit me. The only city where I didn't see him was Ephesus, which is actually in Turkey, not Greece. I'm not exactly a person who believes in the paranormal, but I spent hours trying to rationalize these visions, and nothing I thought of made sense. When my niece Maria got married in Athens last summer, I ended up returning to the city, having no other option. And as if it were fate, there he was again. This time I saw him for a brief second, wearing the same clothes near the bar, looking in my direction. To be completely honest, with so many intoxicated people around, it might have been my imagination. Either way, I swore to myself that I would never set foot in Greece again. Since then, I've avoided anything related to Greece. No Greek food, no Greek mythology books, not even watching movies set in Greece. When I try to make sense of it all, I wonder if maybe, in some way, James was trying to warn me about something through this apparition. The dates matching, the name being the same, it feels too specific to be a mere hallucination. Or perhaps grief can manifest in ways we don't fully understand, creating experiences that blur the line between reality and something else entirely. Whatever the explanation, the memory of those encounters continues to haunt me. A reminder that there are things in this world that defy logical explanation. I sometimes wonder if I'll ever find peace with this experience, or if it will follow me forever, just as that mysterious man followed me through Greece. I'm a senior at the University of North Carolina, and my sorority sisters call me Emma. Last summer, I went to the Caribbean with a few friends to relax a bit. We had just turned 21, and of course, the idea for the vacation was to toast again, and enjoy every moment. I felt we all deserved this break after a heavy semester, full of sorority life drama and the rush of studies. We were a group of four: me, Olivia, Madison, and Zoe. My relationship with Zoe had always been a bit complicated. We had some silly disagreements, and I always imagined she was somewhat jealous. Maybe because I never dedicated much time to the gym and didn't worry much about what I ate. I think you understand what I mean. Anyway, I was very close to Olivia and Madison, so I expected the trip to be amazing. We chose a Carnival cruise that would pass through several Caribbean islands before returning to Miami. The first stop was at an island called Paradise Island, and it was exactly there that the fun began. All four of us were already quite tipsy at the bar, laughing and giving attention to the guys who offered us drinks. It was genuinely fun. At one point, Madison asked me to get a drink for her, so I went to the bar, ordered the drinks, and waited. Madison soon appeared by my side to pick up hers when the drinks arrived. I felt like taking a selfie with Madison before we went back to the table. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos with the drinks. It was then that Olivia called Madison, who, quite drunk, walked away without me and left her drink behind. To make sure no one would take her drink, I put my phone on the counter and held the glass with my other hand. With both drinks, I went to the table where everyone was and joked with Madison about how forgetful she was. Shortly after, it was time to return to the ship. As it began to depart, I started looking for my phone, overcome by desperation. I felt like a complete idiot as I realized I had left my phone at the bar. The frustration made me cry, and the feeling that this would ruin the entire trip was inevitable. I wanted to jump into the sea just for having lost my phone on the first day. I took out my laptop to try to locate the device. To my surprise, it wasn't on the island. It appeared to be somewhere inside the ship itself. The exact location was difficult to identify, but it at least seemed that someone had found it and perhaps turned it in to the lost and found. When I went to the lost and found, the response was a cold shower. No one had returned a phone. The relief turned to frustration. Why would someone take my phone without intending to return it? I went back to the group and vented again. Olivia tried to reassure me, saying I should focus on enjoying the trip. I decided to follow her advice. I spent an entire day without thinking about the phone, which I considered quite an achievement. You don't realize how much time you spend on your phone until it's gone. Several times I wanted to take a selfie or check social media, only to remember I was without it. The next day, while I was at the front of the ship, I opened my laptop to check the location of my phone once more, purely out of curiosity. To my surprise, the location appeared to be almost on top of me. I looked around, but with so many people nearby, anyone could have my phone. I told my friends about this, and they were just as shocked as I was, except for Zoe, who seemed to be holding back laughter. I was really irritated to realize she found the situation funny. A few hours later, we were at the stern of the ship, playing games. I took out my laptop again, and the location of the phone continued to show up very close to me. At that point, I was furious. Whoever had my phone seemed to be following me. My suspicion fell on Zoe. She always saw this as a big joke. I confronted her with the location shown on the laptop, but she insisted she had no idea where my phone was, and even called me careless for not taking care of it. We had a disagreement and ended up exchanging harsh words. I asked her to empty her pockets and bag, which she did reluctantly. No phone. She even gave me a smirk and called me an idiot. I left there upset and in tears. I spent the rest of the day in the room and refused to do anything with Zoe for the rest of the night. For the next 2 days, I avoided her company as much as possible, preferring to be alone and check the locator on my phone from time to time, without much hope. Upon returning to the room that night, I noticed something unusual. There was an envelope on the floor, pushed under the door. It was a handwritten letter. I began to read and felt horrified. Some random guy who called himself Blake Wallace apparently found my unlocked phone, looked through it, thought I was attractive, and decided to write to me to declare his passion. The letter was short, but the disgust I felt was profound. A complete stranger had had full access to my phone and knew my room number. I was on the verge of tears. I took the case to the ship's security, hoping they could do something, but unfortunately, they were of no help. The good news was that this Blake guy didn't contact me again, and the cruise finally ended. Zoe and I reconciled, and all of us parted ways. I wish I could say the story ended there, but actually, it didn't. That same night, already at home after my dad brought me back, I stayed up late watching reality shows on my laptop, and then it occurred to me, why not check the location of the phone now? I felt a bit silly for not having thought of this before. I opened the app and waited for it to load. To my shock, the blue dot indicated that the phone was exactly at my house. I felt a chill. I let out a scream, waking up my family. My dad ran into the room, quickly understood what was happening, and went out barefoot with his hunting rifle in hand. I followed my dad closely. He fired a shot into the air and shouted with all his might, causing a man to jump the side gate and run down the street. My dad hesitated, but eventually decided to chase after him. I was in shock. We went together to the yard to check, and the scene was terrifying. One of the yard ladders was propped against the side of the house, right below my bedroom window. Even more disturbing was realizing that the small wooden latch above the window was almost completely cut. A few more minutes, and he could have managed to open the window. I probably wouldn't be here to tell this story if I had gone to sleep instead of checking the location of the phone. We filed a police report, and it's been almost 2 weeks without new incidents. I still have difficulty sleeping, knowing that a stranger has access to all my information, photos, name, contacts, address. My phone has been deactivated, but I can't help imagining what kind of data he managed to keep. The days since this incident have been filled with anxiety. I installed extra security measures in the house, including motion sensor lights and a more robust alarm system. My dad even considered getting a dog for additional security and companionship. The police told us they're investigating, but without many leads, there's not much they can do. They've increased patrols in our neighborhood, which provides a small measure of comfort. Whenever I think about how close that man came to entering my room, a wave of nausea washes over me. I've started seeing a therapist to help process the trauma, which has been somewhat helpful, but the sense of violation remains. I've warned all my friends to be more careful with their belongings and information, especially while traveling. Something as simple as a lost phone turned into a nightmarish ordeal that continues to affect my daily life. I'll update if anything else happens, though I sincerely hope this is the end of it. For now, I'm just trying to regain some sense of normalcy and security in my life. It might seem a bit unusual to some of you, but I've always dreamed of being a bartender on a cruise ship. I don't know exactly why, but life at sea sounds incredibly peaceful to me. Besides, I'm the type of person you'd call sociable, and the truth is, people you meet on these ships have the most fascinating stories to share. A few years ago, I managed to realize this youthful dream. In my mid-20s, I already had considerable experience in bartending, which facilitated the interview process. Royal Caribbean hired me as a bartender, and the beginning was promising. I don't want to tire you with unimportant details about my time there, but it's worth mentioning that this job brought many travels, sometimes even in excess. In just 2 voyages, I served 3 times more customers than at my local bar in Seattle over 2 months. The constant flow of people was intense, but that was precisely one of the reasons that led me to seek this opportunity. This story happened during my 3rd tour, a 12-day transatlantic cruise between New York, Portugal, and Spain. It was a long journey. We would be at sea for 6 consecutive days. There was a silver lining, though. I would finally return to Europe, and with Royal Caribbean's authorization, could take 1 or 2 weeks to visit my hometown in Marseille. To begin with, I'm already accustomed to drunk and somewhat flirtatious customers asking for drinks, whether they're attractive or not, young or older. Working at night has always involved this dynamic. But on this specific cruise, there was one customer who ended up standing out from the rest. This tall, charming man, a little over 30, couldn't help but catch my attention every night. He always found a place at the bar, savoring his drinks unhurriedly. Gradually, we ended up talking about our lives, and he became the last customer to leave when the night ended. For the first time in a long time, I looked forward to those early morning hours when Sebastian would hang around. I could sense there was something profound in his clear green gaze, a sadness that seemed imprinted on his features. On the 3rd night, he finally opened up, and the story was painful. Reluctantly, he shared about his troubled marriage, pausing frequently as if weighing each word. His wife, Victoria, was involved with Martin, his best friend from college days. I won't go into details, but it seemed devastating. He even shared their full names, as if he had long needed to unload this burden on someone. He continued, saying he had embarked on this cruise alone, hoping the vastness of the ocean would help alleviate his pain. I honestly didn't know how to respond, other than to keep his glass always full. On the night before we docked in Porto, he thanked me for the company and the attentive ear. "You made this trip bearable," he said. Let me buy you a drink as a token of gratitude. It wasn't the first time someone had offered me a drink, but this time it was different. I felt a real connection with him, and what he had gone through seemed like an injustice to me. I accepted, saying I was glad to have been of help in such a complicated moment. Usually I would prepare my own drink, but he insisted on being the one to do it, claiming it was the polite and fair gesture. I should have maintained a professional boundary, but his insistence, combined with the vulnerability he seemed to exhibit, convinced me. I reluctantly accepted and allowed him to come behind the counter, a decision that perhaps changed my life. He prepared the drink with steady hands and handed it to me with a subtle but melancholic smile. The taste was normal, but a few minutes later, a strong drowsiness began to take over my senses. I tried to support myself on the edge of the counter, but everything went dark as I collapsed in an unexpected stupor. I didn't even have time to scream. When I regained consciousness, the vision was terrifying. I was in my own room, but everything seemed ransacked, as if a tornado had passed through. Panic overtook me as I realized I was tied to the bed, with a towel placed in my mouth. A wave of relief washed over me when I noticed my clothes were intact and untouched. About an hour later, room service found me and freed me. A whole day had passed, and the ship was leaving Lisbon. What I felt was more anger than anything else. How could I have been so naive? I had fallen for Sebastian's cunning charm, who took advantage of my sympathy to execute his scheme. I began to doubt if that was even his real name. My suite, as I mentioned, was completely ransacked. My jewelry, my phone, and my personal belongings had disappeared. The safe was wide open and empty. Even my suitcase was gone. The ship's security team made a real fuss about the incident, of course without involving the passengers, but among themselves. They reviewed the cameras and discovered that the guy had disembarked earlier than planned in Porto, never returning to the ship. The crew had no choice but to continue the voyage when he didn't appear at the scheduled time on the gangway. They insisted I keep quiet about the subject, advising me not to take the case public. They offered a generous compensation and promised they would find him soon. After all, he had used a passport to book the trip. In the weeks after the cruise, they contacted me again to update me on what they had discovered. As the ship had not yet returned to the United States, it was a hassle trying to involve the American police and report all the details of the crime and the criminal. Portugal proved to be a bit more cooperative and conducted a search, but even I knew the chances of him still being there were minimal. Eventually, the United States authorities also got involved and launched an extensive investigation. The identities the man had used were all authentic. Passport, name, address, everything was real. They went first to the registered address. The owner informed them that Sebastian had moved a little over a month before, without leaving anything behind. He had a personal phone number which, of course, was disconnected. The police searched for any property in his name, but there was nothing. His criminal record was impeccably clean. The guy had never even had a traffic ticket. They visited his previous jobs, where the story was always the same. The only address was the one he had left, and the only phone they had was the one he had already disconnected. I was furious. They had all his identity information in hand. Surely, there was something more they could have done. But I couldn't help blaming myself for all this. Maybe you think the story ends here, but it's far from it. I requested an extended leave from Royal Caribbean, trying to distance myself from this whole situation. But things only got worse. About a month later, I received the first envelope. An envelope with no identification was left at my apartment door, with just a single photo inside. It was an image of me walking to my car after shopping. The urge I had was to scream. A week later came the second envelope. Another photo, this time of a casual moment while I was shopping at the mall. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the photos kept coming. The envelopes arrived one after another, each with a new image of me captured without my noticing. Each photo was a silent provocation, a reminder that he was still there, watching me. There are no words to describe the constant fear I felt during these weeks. I was afraid to leave the house. I couldn't go to work, meet friends, or even shop without constantly looking over my shoulder. After receiving the sixth envelope, I went to the police. You're probably wondering why I didn't seek help with the first envelope. Honestly, I don't know how to answer that. The police didn't help much. It seemed they didn't know how to handle the situation. But I wanted my case to be registered in case something more serious happened. And that's exactly what happened. One night, I heard knocks on my bedroom window. I knew it was him. The police were called but found nothing, and I ended up even more terrified than before they arrived. I had reached my limit. I moved apartments shortly after, without leaving a forwarding address, changing all my emails, and reinforcing my security as much as possible. Fortunately, I never heard from that man again, but it's only been about 3 months, so I hope I'm not attracting bad luck by writing this. My guess is that he managed to unlock my phone while I was unconscious, and with that, he had access to all my information. The worst thing about all this isn't what was taken, or the fact that I had to restart my life in another place. The hardest thing to accept is that I will never again wish to work on a cruise ship, nor do I know if I want to continue as a bartender. It's amazing how suddenly a dream can transform into a true nightmare. Whenever I reflect on this experience, I realize how our perceptions can be so easily manipulated. Sebastian appeared to be this wounded soul, someone who needed understanding and compassion, but all along, he was calculating his next move. I wonder how many other women he's done this to, how many other lives he's disrupted with his elaborate scheme. The police suggested that he might be part of a larger operation targeting cruise ships, specifically because of their transient nature. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, the perpetrators are long gone, vanished into another country, another jurisdiction. I've considered returning to Marseille, back to my roots and family, where I might feel safer. But I refuse to let this man drive me out of the country I've made my home. Instead, I've taken self-defense classes, installed comprehensive security systems, and joined a support group for victims of stalking. If there's one thing I've gained from this nightmare, it's a new perspective on trust and vigilance. I'm no longer the naive bartender who believed in the goodness of strangers without question. And while that's a little sad, I believe it's a necessary evolution, a hard lesson that might one day save my life again. I've worked as a nurse in various hospitals and health centers over the years. Before my current position at a hospital in Colorado Springs, I spent time at a geriatric center, a reasonable distance from my home. Since I already had experience caring for the elderly, the adaptation wasn't a surprise. I had been at this facility for only a few weeks when everything happened. As you'll understand shortly, it was during my penultimate shift there, though I didn't know it at the time. It was the beginning of the night, and I was working the graveyard shift. The accumulation of sleepless hours was already visible on my face. That night, I was responsible for the Alzheimer's wing, where the patients had an enormous affection for me. Being in my 20s, my presence among them seemed to bring a touch of novelty, a connection with the present and everyday life that they rarely had. The loneliness often made their minds drift, but my presence somehow connected them to the present moment. I was caring for several patients that night, but one in particular was more restless than usual. Her name was Alina, and it was my first time taking care of her. Every time I entered her room, Alina would comment about the voices she heard, and the man dressed in black she saw in one of the corners of the room. The lady who shared the room with her had asked for the curtain to be closed before my shift began, hoping Alina would leave her in peace. Alina was a kind lady who always smiled when I was around, although she spoke little and was very forgetful. I began my shift later in the night, when most patients were already asleep, except for Alina. Every time she called me to the room, she seemed frightened, talking about voices she heard, and the man in black who continued to observe her from one of the corners of the room. I won't deny that it gave me a certain chill. I believed that in her mind, all of this was very real, and I sympathized, imagining how terrifying this must be. Still, I did my best to calm her down and encourage her to sleep. I avoided turning on the TV so as not to disturb the other patient in the room. So I held Alina's hands and asked her to breathe deeply and relax. I reinforced that she wasn't alone, that I was always nearby. This seemed to help her, because when I returned to the room, I found her sleeping. When all the patients finally fall asleep, the early morning hours seem to drag on, almost as if time stops. A bit later, I was in the laundry room restocking the cart when I heard something strange inside. The room was quite small and silent, and I kept the door closed, so that sound surprised me. I turned around but saw nothing, so I continued to stock the cart. Suddenly, I felt a pressure on my shoulder, as if a hand were touching me. I looked at my shoulder, jumped, and let out a scream, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, but I was certain I had felt something grab my shoulder. I peered into the corridor to see if there was another nurse nearby, but I only found silence. Without much else to do, I returned to work, trying to ignore what had just happened. I continued replenishing the cart until it was completely stocked. When I turned to face the door, I fell to the ground with a scream, feeling my heart leap into my throat. A man dressed in black was standing outside, looking through the glass of the door and smiling. My scream was loud enough to wake up the entire wing. Within seconds, he vanished from the window. The door opened, and a colleague nurse entered to help me, seeing my state of desperation. I asked if she had seen the man in black, but her response was, "What man? There's no one else here." Together, we checked all the rooms. There was no man in black. My screams had also awakened Alina from a light sleep, and when I entered her room, she began to talk about the voices and now the screams, not knowing they were mine. I asked how the man in black looked, if he was smiling, and I saw her furrow her brows, adopting a focused expression I hadn't seen before. She asked me, "How did you know?" And even with my heart still racing, I felt a chill. Then she also began to scream, begging us to take her away from there, saying that he was coming. The other nurses came in and tried to calm her down. After that, I was transferred to another wing, and that night, I ended up going home early because of the scare. The next day, I sent a message to the head nurse, letting her know that my next shift would be my last, as the experience had been too much for me. I received a somewhat understanding response, as expected. I never received a diagnosis of anything related to hallucinations, and was always aware of the effects of sleep deprivation. But what I felt that night was something completely out of the ordinary. I don't know if my mind was influenced by what Alina mentioned repeatedly, but the sensation of that hand on my shoulder and the vision of the smiling man at the door, which was exactly as she described, are things I can't explain. The days following that incident were filled with anxiety. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling watched even in the safety of my own apartment. Sleep became elusive, which was ironic considering I had left the night shift partly due to exhaustion. I started keeping a small light on in my bedroom at night, something I hadn't done since childhood. The shadow of the man in black seemed to lurk in every dark corner, waiting. I tried to rationalize that it was just my imagination working overtime, fueled by stress and the power of suggestion from Alina's vivid descriptions. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The pressure of that hand on my shoulder had been too real, too tangible to dismiss as mere imagination. And the face at the window, that smile that seemed to know something I didn't, haunted me even in my waking hours. About a week after leaving the geriatric center, I received an unexpected call from my former colleague. She informed me that Alina had passed away in her sleep 2 nights after my departure. The news hit me harder than I expected. Despite our brief interaction, I felt a connection with her that I couldn't quite explain. What troubled me most was what my colleague said next. The strangest thing is that before she died, she kept saying that the man in black wasn't there for her anymore. She said he had found someone new to follow. A cold dread settled over me as I hung up the phone. That night, I woke suddenly from a deep sleep with the distinct feeling that someone was in my room, watching me from the corner. I turned on the light immediately, heart pounding, but found nothing. As I lay back down, trying to steady my breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was as if a door had been opened that night at the geriatric center, a door that shouldn't have been opened, and whatever had come through was now fixated on me. I've since moved to a different state and taken a position at a new hospital. I rarely work night shifts now, and I've made it a point never to be alone in small, enclosed spaces at work. Some might call it paranoia, but I prefer to think of it as a necessary precaution. Sometimes, when I'm alone and the light is just right, I catch glimpses of a shadow that shouldn't be there in my peripheral vision. It's gone when I turn to look, but I just know it's him. The man in black, waiting, watching, and sometimes I swear I can feel the weight of his hand on my shoulder, just before I drift off to sleep. I don't know if I'll ever be free of him, or if he'll follow me for the rest of my life. All I know is that some things in this world defy explanation, and once you've encountered them, you can never truly go back to the person you were before. It's been 5 years since I was diagnosed with bacterial meningitis. I live in northern Oregon, and as far as I know, there wasn't any outbreak in the region at the time. So I really have no idea how I contracted the disease, or from whom I might have caught it. The symptoms I began to experience were quite intense. Piercing headaches, mental confusion, extreme drowsiness, nausea, and loss of appetite. However, when the hallucinations started, I was certain something was very wrong. I was lying in bed feeling awful, while my husband was at work. Suddenly, I heard a childlike voice calling "Mommy" from downstairs. The thing is, we don't have children. Even though I was debilitated, I dragged myself out of bed and went to the stairs to call my husband's name. As expected, he didn't answer since he was at work. The headache only worsened when I stood up, so I returned to bed. That's when I heard it again, a voice from below, this time saying, "Hello." I grabbed the phone and called my husband in panic, telling him I was hearing a frightening childlike voice inside the house, and that I was probably hallucinating. He realized how distressed I was, and left work early to take me to the hospital. While waiting for him to arrive, I changed out of my pajamas, but soon had to run to the bathroom to vomit. During the retching, I heard another voice, this time from outside the bathroom. I couldn't understand what it said or identify if it was the same voice as before. At this point, I felt completely out of it. I was only diagnosed at the hospital, where I discovered that my condition, if untreated, could be very serious, even fatal. The doctor mentioned that hallucinations were a rare but possible symptom. As soon as I arrived at the hospital, they administered antibiotics through a needle, and my husband stayed by my side throughout the process. The doctor told me I was very lucky to have gone to the hospital so quickly. If I had waited longer, it could have left permanent sequelae or even been fatal. My husband stayed with me in the room for a few hours, and the doctors informed me that I would need to remain hospitalized between a few days and a week due to the severity of the symptoms. Around 10 o'clock, he went home because he had work the next morning. The nurse recommended that I call if I needed help. Though I felt terrible, I quickly fell asleep. I soon had a dream in which my ex-husband was in the room, leaning over my bed and staring at me while he spoke. He was saying horrible things about my current husband, stroking my head, and saying he was glad I was feeling better. He told me he came as soon as he realized my husband had gone home. He continued to speak angrily about how much he despises my husband and that he wanted to kill him. He kept rubbing my forehead until he left the room. Unfortunately, I often have nightmares about him because of the toxic and abusive relationship we had and the way everything ended, but I prefer not to elaborate on that. I woke up in a state of drowsiness and dizziness, looking around the room. I noticed there was a chair positioned in front of my bed, but it was empty. It wasn't like that before my husband left. It was still early morning, so I tried to sleep again. The next morning, I woke up with the nurse in the room. I told her about the strange and vivid dream I had, and she laughed, saying that it wasn't a dream. In fact, my cousin had come to visit me during the night. I explained that I don't have cousins living in the state. She became more serious and said, "Well, someone who said he was your cousin Marcus came late at night to see you." Marcus was my ex-husband's name. After explaining the situation better, the nurse called a doctor who explained that the antibiotics could have caused delirium, compromising my ability to differentiate between sleep and wakefulness. This would explain why Marcus's words sounded so real. I called my husband to tell him what had happened. Of course, he was very concerned and indignant. Later, he returned to the hospital after work, but before that, I sent a message to Marcus asking why he decided to visit me and how he knew I was hospitalized. He received the message but didn't respond. I sent another right after, mentioning I heard his threats against my husband and that I would involve the police. Minutes later, he finally responded, "I never threatened your husband. I just went to the hospital to see how you were doing. You must have heard something while you were sleeping." I retorted, "Stay out of my life or I will involve the police." This time, he didn't respond. I decided not to tell my husband about the threats I heard while in that stuporous state, because I wasn't sure if they were real. With the mixture of antibiotics and the auditory hallucinations I had already experienced the day before, it was possible that what I heard wasn't exactly what he said, but I still wasn't entirely certain. I was discharged from the hospital the following week, and the situation slowly faded from my immediate concerns. Life moved on, and I tried to put the unsettling experience behind me. 3 months later, however, something occurred that reopened all those questions and fears. While sorting through some mail, I found a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "I hope you're feeling better. The medication they gave you at the hospital can cause such vivid dreams, can't it? But what if they weren't all dreams?" There was no signature, no name, nothing to identify the sender, but the implication was clear enough. I immediately showed the letter to my husband, who contacted the police. They took a report, but explained there wasn't much they could do based on such a vague message. We installed a security system the next day, cameras, motion sensors, the works. For weeks, I jumped at every sound, convinced that Marcus was watching our house, waiting for another opportunity to get close to me. The most disturbing aspect was how he had managed to find me at the hospital that night. I hadn't posted anything on social media about my illness, and only a handful of close friends knew I had been hospitalized. Had he been monitoring me somehow? Following me? The possibilities were chilling. My husband suggested that we move, possibly to another state entirely, to put distance between us and my ex. We seriously considered it, even looking at job opportunities and housing markets elsewhere. The constant anxiety was affecting my sleep, my work, and my overall mental health. Then, 6 months after the letter arrived, we received devastating news. Marcus had been killed in a car accident. A drunk driver had hit him head-on. While I would never wish death on anyone, I can't deny that the news brought a profound sense of relief. The shadow that had been looming over me finally lifted. Or so I thought. 2 weeks after his funeral, which I did not attend, another envelope arrived. The message inside read simply, "Death changes nothing. I'll always be watching over you." The postmark showed it had been mailed the day after Marcus died. I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of it all. Was it possible that he had prepared the letter in advance, arranging for someone to mail it in case of his death? Or was there something more inexplicable at work, something that defied rational explanation? The police were equally baffled, but maintained that the most likely explanation was that someone else was involved, perhaps a friend of Marcus's, continuing his harassment campaign. They promised to investigate, but without concrete leads, there wasn't much they could do. We did eventually move, though not out of state. We found a house in a gated community with excellent security, which has provided some peace of mind. I've also been seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma and PTSD, which has been tremendously helpful. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before falling asleep, I still catch myself listening for voices that shouldn't be there. And occasionally, just as I'm drifting off, I could swear I feel the mattress sink slightly, as if someone were sitting on the edge of the bed, watching me sleep. I don't know if these experiences are remnants of the hallucinations, manifestations of trauma, or something else entirely. What I do know is that the line between what's real and what's imagined can sometimes blur in the most unsettling ways, leaving questions that may never find answers. A few months ago, my Aunt Catherine, who's been my mother's closest friend since childhood, finally beat cancer after an extensive, difficult, and incredibly painful battle. She truly conquered this disease. When she gave my mother the news, it was the first time I'd ever seen her cry and let out a scream of pure joy, a curious sound that resembled pain, but quickly transformed into uncontrollable laughter. Days later, they organized a large celebration where not only family and friends gathered, but also everyone who had supported her throughout those years of struggle when she never surrendered. My older sister couldn't attend, but left her son, my 3-year-old nephew Ethan, with us. We brought him to the party because, according to my mother, there would certainly be other children there, an argument she used when I complained, knowing that, as always, the responsibility of looking after him would fall solely on me. At the celebration, thankfully, he quickly found a room where another boy was playing, and the two began entertaining themselves. However, when they started playing hide-and-seek, I kept watch from outside because I wanted to ensure he didn't wander off to explore. Each time he left the room, I observed him to make sure he didn't stray too far until he returned to where he was playing. The house seemed quite peaceful inside, but the surrounding area had an unsettling atmosphere, almost like a haunted house. The celebration took place in that secluded stone house that belonged to my Aunt Catherine's great aunt. I didn't know her family very well, but it was clear there was considerable wealth involved. The house was primarily constructed of stone and refined wood, with an air of antique luxury. From the moment we approached the entrance, I told my mother the place looked like it was straight out of a horror film. That's why I didn't want to let Ethan out of my sight, since he's quite mischievous and always ends up hiding somewhere. While he was playing inside, I suddenly heard the sound of a slap, followed immediately by the sight of Ethan leaving the room crying and holding his face. I asked what had happened, and he told me the boy he was playing with had hit him. So off I went after the kid to confront him. As soon as I entered the room, I turned on the light to ask why he had done that, and I saw him escaping through a wooden door. I didn't know where it led, but I had no intention of following him. I gestured to my mother, who was approaching, probably alerted by Ethan's crying. Aunt Catherine arrived too. I told them the boy had hit Ethan and then run through that door, but that I didn't want to follow him since I didn't know what was on the other side. Before my mother could react, Catherine asked if I had seen the boy, or if Ethan had simply told me about him. I replied that yes, I had clearly seen him playing with Ethan and entering through that door when I went to speak to him. Catherine approached, opened the door, and inside was a tiny space, almost like an empty pantry. There was no one inside, and it was impossible for anyone to have left. There were just 3 closed walls. We left the party immediately, all of us frightened, especially my mother and I. Of course, we didn't say anything to Ethan. The curious part came later when my mother told me what Catherine had said. Apparently, ghost stories had always circulated about that house, but Catherine had never seen anything since childhood. She hadn't witnessed anything strange until the moment she went there, very ill at the height of her battle against cancer, when she thought she wouldn't survive. She told us that during this period, a boy like the one I saw and a very frightening elderly lady frequently appeared to her. She described this woman as an old lady with long gray hair and black eyes, who wandered through the house in the dark, holding a candle. Her great aunt, the owner of the house, told her to ignore it, arguing that it was merely an effect of her illness. But what's most intriguing is that currently, children who visit the house also see this boy, although only the very young ones. Catherine was truly shaken, not so much by the fact that Ethan had seen him, but because he had managed to touch him, to make contact with the boy. And what surprised her the most was that now, at 17 years old, I had also been able to see him. It's as if whatever had appeared in that moment of pain hadn't disappeared with her recovery, as she thought it would. On the contrary, it seems to be growing stronger. My story might be quite short, and perhaps lacks the depth of others typically shared, but a friend suggested I tell it, so here I am, narrating what was undoubtedly the most frightening experience I've ever lived through. I'm a flight attendant, and although I can't reveal the airline, I typically work on international flights. This happened about 2 years ago on one of my first flights to Norway. It was also my first time on this route. At the last minute, a young Norwegian man boarded, and we were asked to wait for him. He seemed to be an important person, a little over 30, very handsome, and extremely polite, something I confess I don't always expect to find in passengers of that profile. Usually, people with the appearance of status and good family are more distant and don't always treat us with much attention. But this one was different, captivating, and attentive. He even made a few jokes with the crew, and his presence made the flight lighter. Each time we approached to attend to him, at disembarkation, he approached me and 2 colleagues, suggesting that if we still had energy that night, we could visit a nightclub owned by friends of his. He assured us that if we went, we would be well received as appreciation for our service during the flight. The 3 of us were young, relatively new to the job, and excited to explore Oslo. So that same night, we remembered the mysterious young man's invitation. I'll call him Alexander, although I know that's not a name I would use publicly. We were close to the location, so at a certain point in the evening, we decided to go. At the entrance, we said what he had instructed us, that we were his guests. We were immediately allowed entry and taken to a separate table, completely VIP. After some time, already considering leaving, Alexander suddenly appeared, visibly thrilled to see us and know that we had accepted his invitation. He seemed genuinely surprised, as if he really thought we wouldn't show up. It was a strange feeling. The confidence and charm he displayed on the flight had given way to an unexpected shyness. He was truly grateful for our presence, something that intrigued me. After all, he was the type who could get anything he wanted. After greeting us warmly, he stepped away for a while, asking that we not leave yet. It was late when he returned, and my friends were exhausted, trying to convince me to leave. At that moment, Alexander held my hand and asked me to stay a little longer, promising he would take me to the hotel afterward. The idea of getting to know him better seemed attractive. After all, he was an enigmatic figure. I have to confess, at that time I was quite inexperienced, and in a way trusted people like him, millionaires, as if they were incapable of anything terrible. What could happen? What would be the worst outcome? I thought, single, flirting with a charming Norwegian multimillionaire. Honestly, who wouldn't have agreed to stay a little longer? Finally, in the early hours of the morning, he suggested we go to his house. Just when I was about to refuse, he assured me that nothing needed to happen, that the house was enormous, and I could sleep in one of the rooms. In the morning, he would take me back to the hotel after breakfast. I agreed. I perfectly remember the car that pulled up beside us. Although I don't understand much about models, that emblem with the winged figure on the hood was unmistakable. It was a Bentley. When the driver opened the door for us, Alexander stayed back a bit, apparently saying goodbye to someone. I precisely recall the moment the driver extended his hand to help me in, asking if I was tired or a bit intoxicated. I replied no. Then he offered to take me to the hotel if I preferred. I insisted everything was fine, that we were going to Alexander's house. It was then that, with a serious look, he told me much more than any word could express. If at any moment you prefer that we take you to the hotel, just let me know, okay? There was something disturbing in the way he stared at me, almost begging for me to give up and leave. But I didn't understand. When we finally got into the car, I looked for a sign from Alexander that would restore my confidence, something that would dispel the sense of alarm transmitted by the driver. However, I noticed another change in him. He was no longer the confident young man I'd met on the plane, nor the shy guy from the nightclub. Before me, he seemed just like an insecure boy sitting on the other side of the seat and almost unable to complete his sentences. I was about to ask them to take me to the hotel when he said a dry no. At that instant, his gaze changed to something almost threatening, only to soften again and return to the charming tone that had captivated us during the flight. Forgive me, it's been a difficult day. My medications affect my mood, but I'm fine. At least they've helped me stop drinking, and I feel better, you know. Much healthier. I hope you didn't find me inconvenient. "It's okay," I replied. "I just thought you might be tired and prefer to rest." I didn't know the city, but it was clear from the path we were taking that we were no longer in Oslo. We entered an area where the houses were immense, larger than I could have imagined. That young man undoubtedly came from a much more important family than I had supposed. We continued through a vast property, traveling along an avenue that led us to a monumental house, like those seen in films. Then we climbed a bit more and stopped in front of another, much smaller house, but one that still seemed like a true mansion to me. "Here I am. It's where I live, to not disturb my family with my things," he said with a distant look as the car door was opened for us. "My family doesn't have much patience with me anymore," he added, smiling. As he said this, he touched his temple, as if indicating his head, and I wondered if perhaps he suffered from depression or something similar, and his family didn't want to deal with these issues. At that moment, I felt a mixture of pity and empathy for him. As soon as we got out of the car, he hurried to enter the house, and I found it strange that he hadn't waited for me. It was a somewhat rude gesture, quite different from the behavior he had shown before. However, when the driver handed me my coat, he murmured something I could barely understand, but it seemed to be, "The car will be ready all the time." Upon entering, I heard Alexander shouting to someone, announcing that he had arrived. I asked if there was anyone else in the house, and he replied no, that I didn't need to worry. He was just talking to the dogs. He said I didn't need to be afraid, that they were locked up because they get a bit aggressive when excited. I settled into a room where he opened the windows to reveal a spectacular view. He mentioned that he would change into something more comfortable because he had something special to show me. While waiting, I began to hear a persistent sound. The dogs were scratching at the door where they were locked and letting out desperate whimpers. I called out to Alexander to let them out, explaining that I was used to large dogs. I grew up in a house with a Rottweiler and a Great Dane, so I wouldn't be easily frightened. Alexander quickly came down, with an enthusiastic expression on his face. He asked if I would like to play with them, and I replied yes, that I was eager to do so. "Great," he said before giving a slight kick to the door, as if wanting to push them away, or as if he were dealing with wild animals. That bothered me. Immediately afterward, he opened the door and gave it a push. It was a heavy door and barely moved. "Well, I'll finish changing. Wait for them to come out on their own. No rush. I'll be back soon," he said hurriedly before going back upstairs. I waited for the dogs to come out, expecting them to emerge full of energy and ready to play, but nothing happened. I called to them several times in an affectionate tone, but there was no response. I returned to the room and sat with my back to the door, trying to give them a safer environment to come out if they were scared. Still, they continued scratching at the door, releasing low whimpers that echoed sadness. The house was plunged into semi-darkness, the only light coming from a small lamp in the room. I felt a certain sadness thinking about the dogs locked in that darkness, but I imagined they might be sleeping. Even so, I went to the door of that room, ready to call them. I never miss a chance to play with a dog. In the darkness, on a luxurious leather sofa, something seemed to be playing large figures, one much larger than me and another more slender, of smaller stature, closer to mine. They were entertained among themselves, but upon seeing me, they turned in my direction. They were two people locked in there, wearing hyper-realistic dog costumes. But as I watched them rise and move with difficulty on all fours toward me, it became clear they were indeed people. I fled running, and to my surprise, there was no car at the entrance as promised. But in the distance, I spotted a figure in front of the main house, the large one. I ran down there at full speed and said I needed to get out of there. The man, who must have been over 70, was washing the other Bentley. He looked behind me toward the house I had just left with an expression of disgust and told me to quickly get in the car. I could see at the door of the house I had just left the dogs watching me. "Don't look back. Who did you escape from?" he said. He asked where I wanted to go, and I gave the hotel address. I mentioned that Alexander's driver had promised me he would always be waiting at the door, and the man just laughed, as if mocking my naivety. I didn't quite understand what had happened, and the driver didn't say another word. He took me to the hotel in complete silence. I didn't ask questions either. I was confused and increasingly dizzy, to the point of feeling like vomiting. I took out my cell phone to notify my friends, perhaps share my location, but the phone was off. I didn't know since when. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd looked at it. Upon arriving at the hotel, I found my friends awake, very worried. It seems that someone, upon seeing me leave with Alexander, warned them that I was in danger, that I was getting involved in something truly obscure. I felt immense gratitude for being back with them, and spent a good while not going out in cities we visited, and even more so, not trusting strangers. Want to know what was strangest? Almost a year later, again in Norway, one of these friends showed me a celebrity magazine, one of those that talk about the elite and high society. She opened it to a page of a recent event. I felt a chill seeing Alexander in the photo with his family. They were all tall, beautiful, happy. He, however, seemed isolated from the others, out of contact, with a worn-out, disturbing expression, as if he could see me through the page. I asked my friend what they had been told that night, what made them worry when I left with Alexander. She replied that they were told some people who left with him didn't come back. That was said with a tone of mystery, as if in quotation marks. Who knows what they really meant, or if that was part of some macabre game in which everyone was involved. Perhaps the advice that calling the police wouldn't help was just another piece of this dark game. I know well there's nothing paranormal about this, and it won't scare those accustomed to stories of ghosts and demonic possessions. But when I remember that dimly lit house, the dogs advancing toward me panting, I relive the greatest horror I've ever felt. Sometimes fear can take strange and disconcerting forms that almost seem like a game, as if someone were having fun testing our fears, exploring our trust. It reminds us that danger can hide in subtle ways, sometimes revealing itself in who we least expect. And just when we believe we've escaped, the uncomfortable doubt remains. Did we really get away? Are we safe? Fortunately, this story I'm about to tell didn't happen to me. I haven't yet had the chance to be the protagonist of an account like this one. The main character here is my grandmother, who shared this experience with us a few years ago. Only recently did I find time to reflect on it, write it down, and share it with you. It all happened a long time ago. My grandmother was born in northern Maine, but as a child, she moved with her parents and siblings to a small town in Vermont. She was around 16 when her Aunt Elaine, whom she deeply adored, passed away. The loss of her aunt was a devastating blow to the entire family. As was customary, everyone gathered to pay a final tribute and returned to Maine for the funeral. After the burial, already at the end of the day, the family met at Aunt Elaine's house for a small gathering in her memory, something that became a tradition in our family. We always felt the importance of remembering our loved ones with a final meeting after the burial. The village where Aunt Elaine lived was small, with unpaved streets and spacious plots of land. Her house was roomy, but divided into different structures. The living room, dining room, and one bedroom were in the main building. The kitchen, on the other hand, was about 6 feet away from the house in a separate construction. 2 other bedrooms were also independent. My grandmother recalls that the house was filled with religious images and figures, and in the windows there were open scissors, a detail that today she considers disturbing. During the gathering in the courtyard, the family was dedicated to remembering stories about Aunt Elaine, reviving her memory with affection. She was, in fact, much loved and respected by everyone. In the midst of this meeting, my grandmother noticed something unusual. 3 elderly women were standing in the yard of the house across the street. They were women of very advanced age, and as she described, had faces far from friendly. These ladies had been there since the family's arrival, and the most disturbing thing was that they didn't avert their gaze to look elsewhere, although they didn't say a word either. Their presence conveyed a profound sensation of discomfort, as if they were merely observing. This fact left my grandmother in a state of unease, difficult to ignore. The house where they stood appeared abandoned, with old and neglected walls. The yard was overgrown with tall weeds, and the fence seemed about to collapse. Gradually, the uneasiness took hold of everyone, creating an eerie atmosphere among those present, as if those women were transmitting a dark energy. Finally, the family decided to move to the backyard to continue the gathering. One of the aunts who had taken care of Aunt Elaine in her last months of life commented that she had never seen those women before, and as far as she knew, the house across the street was unoccupied. They tried to ignore the discomfort, supposing that perhaps the elderly women were acquaintances of Aunt Elaine and were there to pay a final tribute. That same night, most of the family left. My grandmother, however, asked her parents to let her stay another week with her cousins to help them pack up her aunt's belongings. Even so, on the first night, she could barely close her eyes. Her cousins were in the independent rooms of the main house, while she decided to sleep in her aunt's old room. Being there alone, surrounded by her Aunt Elaine's belongings, awakened in her a feeling of nervousness she couldn't explain. As the days passed, the situation became increasingly strange. At first, it was just an uncomfortable sensation, as if someone were watching her all the time, even inside the house. But soon after came the whispers. My grandmother reported that at night, when everything was silent, voices emerged from outside, as if several people were murmuring at once. The most curious thing is that these whispers always seemed to come from the house across the street. About 4 days later, her cousins went out to get something to eat, and since my grandmother was the youngest, she stayed alone in the house, continuing the task of packing her aunt's belongings. While cleaning, she decided to take some trash bags to the yard. It was then that she spotted the three old women again. But this time, there was something different. The old women seemed younger than she remembered. Their faces, still with signs of age, didn't appear as worn, and what caught her attention most was their disturbing smile. An unsettling smile that, unlike their eyes, conveyed anger and fury. A chill ran up my grandmother's spine, who quickly returned inside and locked the door. Later that night, while talking with her cousin Amanda mentioned something peculiar. They had also seen the old women at the market, but there they seemed much older, almost unrecognizable compared to the first time they saw them at the house across the street. However, there was no doubt they were the same women, wearing the same clothes. My grandmother was paralyzed. How could they have seen them in two places at the same time? Moreover, the market was very far from the village, and it was unlikely that those elderly women could move so quickly. That night, after dinner and cleaning up, everyone went to bed. My grandmother preferred to sleep in the living room, as her aunt's room caused her discomfort. In the early morning, she woke up with intense thirst. The kitchen was in a separate room at the end of the backyard, which required her to go outside and walk a few yards to get there. With a racing heart but determined, she opened the back door. In the weak light of the outdoor lamp, she could see one of the old women by the fence that delimited the yard, staring at her. Something in her seemed to have changed. The woman appeared younger, looking about 40, and her posture was more erect, with an intimidating height. Frightened, my grandmother closed the door forcefully and ran back to the sofa, where she curled up under the blankets, unable to move to call her cousins because of the paralyzing fear. Suddenly, she heard loud knocks on the front door. Trembling, she raised her head from under the covers and saw through the window the pale and terrifying face of one of the old women peering at her. It's worth noting that in that era, nights in the village were hot, so she used to sleep with the window open. After a few knocks, the sound ceased, but the room was filled with murmurs, as if several voices were whispering at once. Overcome with terror, she gathered courage and shouted, "You don't have permission to enter. Go back to where you came from." The murmurs transformed into a dark chant, a chilling melody. It was then that she remembered her Aunt Elaine's words. Never underestimate the power of faith and the amulets that protect you. My grandmother, trembling and desperate, grabbed a wooden cross and branches that hung over the sofa. With strength, she held it and began to pray. Gradually, the chants began to fade, but what came next was even more terrifying. From the yard, the old women began to scream with inhuman rage, guttural, almost bestial screams. Even after the screams ceased, she didn't interrupt her prayers, continuing until sleep finally overtook her. That was the last night my grandmother spent in that house. The next morning, she told her cousins what she had experienced. She was frightened, and although her cousins didn't remember hearing anything, they believed every word. They knew my grandmother wasn't one to make up stories, and they all agreed there was something wrong with that house. They decided to leave that very day, gathering their things and leaving without looking back. Over time, my grandmother rarely spoke about this experience, always with caution. She never came to call those old women witches, but it was evident she believed this. She recounted that there was something unnatural about them, in their gazes and in these impossible appearances. She never learned anything more about the old women, but she said that on rainy days, when the house was completely silent, she could hear whispers in the distance, as if the memories remained on guard. "There are things we'll never understand, my child," she told me in her most serious tone, which sounded almost like a reprimand. "But sometimes the important thing is not to seek answers, not to ask what we don't want to know. Sometimes the most important thing is knowing when to step away." These words accompany me to this day, as a constant reminder that there are mysteries better left unexcavated. For sometimes the past carries shadows that continue to observe us closely, that stay with us forever. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.